I still will not enter the Yunlong Nature Reserve even though I know exactly why they closed the third access road. The official report says a landslide made it impassable. The problem is that I arrived at the reserve 2 weeks before that landslide supposedly happened. I watched the road repair logs. They never filled a single pothole on that route. Then, on the same day the ranger station filed the closure notice, a heavy machinery team arrived after dark and physically destroyed the asphalt. I have the dated photographs. I have the maintenance records that contradict each other, and I have the testimony from one ranger who, before he transferred out, told me that the road was not closed because of geological failure. It was closed because of what the rangers had been deliberately preventing tourists from finding. He would not tell me what it was. He said it was safer for me if I did not know. That was 3 years ago. I still think about what I might have learned if I had gone up that third road before they destroyed it. If you listen to unexplained disappearances and structural secrets that connect across years, please subscribe and stay with me. Share this with someone who wonders what kind of incidents would be serious enough to make trained wildlife professionals risk their careers to cover them up. My name is Chen Wei, and I worked as a tourism infrastructure auditor for the Yunnan provincial government. That means I spent roughly half of each year visiting nature reserves, national parks, and protected areas across the province, evaluating facilities, checking compliance with tourism regulations, reviewing visitor safety protocols, and ensuring that park operations met government standards. I had been doing this work for 12 years by the time I first visited Yunlong. I had the clearance to access restricted areas, I could request records, I could observe ranger activities, I could speak to staff without advance notification. The rangers generally saw auditors as bureaucratic obstacles, which meant they were rarely entirely comfortable with my presence, but they understood that cooperating with inspection procedures was mandatory. Yunlong Nature Reserve sits approximately 180 kilometers northeast of Lijiang, in the mountains between the Yangtze River and the Mekong River. The reserve encompasses roughly 88,000 hectares of mixed forest, alpine meadow, and high-altitude plateau. The elevation ranges from 2,200 meters to 4,800 meters. The reserve was established in 1994 primarily to protect the habitat of endangered species like the clouded leopard, the golden monkey, and various high-altitude pheasants. By the time I was assigned to inspect it, the reserve had been operating for over 2 decades with a good reputation. There had been no significant incidents. Visitor satisfaction was high. The ranger staff consisted of about 40 people, distributed across 3 permanent ranger stations and several seasonal outposts. The reserve received approximately 35,000 tourists per year, which was substantial but manageable. I had no reason to expect anything unusual. I arrived at the reserve on a clear morning in late April. The lead ranger, a man named Zhang Lei who had worked at Yunlong for 18 years, met me at the main administration building. He was in his late 50s, weathered by decades in the mountains, with the precise posture of someone accustomed to walking uneven terrain. He was on the surface professionally cordial. He arranged my accommodation in the staff quarters. He provided me with current maps, facility inventories, and emergency protocols. He assigned another ranger, a younger man named Tao Ming, to facilitate my inspection activities. This all proceeded exactly as it had during my previous audits at other reserves. My initial plan was standard. I would spend the first 3 days examining the administrative infrastructure, reviewing recent incident reports, checking equipment maintenance logs, and interviewing key staff members. I would then spend 4 days conducting field inspections of the hiking routes, visitor facilities, and ranger patrol areas. Finally, I would compile my observations and deliver a preliminary assessment before departing. On my first afternoon, I requested access to the incident log for the past 3 years. Zhang Lei provided it without apparent resistance. I reviewed it carefully in my temporary office. The reserve had recorded 17 significant incidents during that period. Most were routine, several cases of mild altitude sickness, 2 instances of minor wildlife aggression that could be attributed to tourists surprising animals, 4 cases of GPS navigation errors that resulted in tourists straying from marked trails, and various equipment malfunctions. The entries were detailed and properly documented. Nothing seemed out of order, but I noticed something that at the time seemed merely procedural. 3 of the 17 incidents had occurred within a specific geographical area, a section of the reserve that occupied the higher elevations in the northern portion. All 3 incidents had resulted in what the log described as incomplete recovery. The language was clinical and vague. One entry, dated almost exactly 2 years prior, described a hiking group of 4 tourists who had become disoriented in dense fog, and required overnight rescue. The rescue had been successful, but the log noted that all 4 subjects exhibited confusion and memory discontinuity following recovery. They had been discharged to local medical facilities and presumably treated for altitude-related neurological effects. The second of these 3 northern area incidents was from 13 months earlier. A solo visitor, a German tourist named Markus Weber, had violated trail markers and entered an unmarked area during poor visibility. Rangers had located him approximately 6 hours later in a state of distress. The log stated that he had suffered unexplained disorientation consistent with severe acute altitude sickness, though his vital signs and oxygen saturation had been normal. He had been evacuated and did not file a formal complaint with the Reserve Administration. The third incident was from 9 months prior. A pair of photographers had attempted to photograph high-altitude birds in the northern alpine zone. They had apparently ignored a ranger verbal warning and proceeded into restricted territory. One of the photographers had suffered what the log described as acute onset psychological distress, while the other had been unaffected. The affected individual had been medically cleared but had voluntarily withdrawn from the reserve. I noted these entries because the geographical clustering was statistically unusual for a reserve of that size. I mentioned the observation to Zhang Lei during my evening meeting with him and Tao Ming. I asked whether there were environmental hazards specific to that northern zone. Zhang Lei's response was measured. He said that the northern alpine area was subject to rapid weather changes, that visibility could diminish very quickly, and that the effects of altitude on different individuals were unpredictable. He recommended that I avoid unscheduled excursions in that direction. He phrased it as a safety precaution, which it may have been. Tao Ming, who was usually more conversational than his supervisor, became noticeably quiet when I asked my questions. He was looking at Zhang Lei during the response, not at me. This detail did not alarm me at the time. It was unusual enough to flag in my mental notes, but not unusual enough to constitute evidence of anything. On my second day at the reserve, I conducted a field walk of the main visitor areas. Tao Ming accompanied me. We inspected the first hiking route, a well-maintained trail that descended from the administration area through mixed forest to a scenic viewpoint overlooking a deep valley. The facilities were excellent. Trail markers were clear and properly spaced. There were safety railings where the terrain dropped away. Rest stations were positioned logically. I observed several other visitors using the route, and their experience seemed positive. Tao Ming was knowledgeable about the local ecology and patient with my procedural questions. At one point, a group of tourists asked him about routes to the higher elevations, and I watched him carefully direct them toward the main eastern trail, which led to the secondary alpine viewpoint. He explicitly noted that this was the recommended route and that other areas at similar elevations were not regularly maintained. I mentioned this guidance technique favorably in my initial observation notes. We completed that trail inspection and returned to the administration building by mid-afternoon. I then reviewed the reserve's emergency response records and communication logs. I was checking to see whether rangers practiced regular radio communication drills and whether emergency protocols were being properly maintained. The communication log contained daily status checks between ranger stations, which was appropriate. I noticed something that initially seemed routine. The rangers conducted their standard radio checks twice daily, at 6 in the morning and 6 in the evening. However, there were several dated entries spanning the past 8 months where the northern outpost, which should have been staffed by at least one ranger, had not responded to the evening check-in. In each case, the log showed that Zhang Lei had recorded the communication failure, and the next morning's check-in had proceeded normally, with no mention of why the evening contact had been missed. There were 8 such instances between August of the previous year and March of the current year. 8 missed evening check-ins, all from the same outpost. I asked Zhang Lei about this during that evening's debriefing. I framed the question as a procedural concern. I asked whether the northern outpost was regularly staffed or whether it operated on a seasonal basis. Zhang Lei said it was maintained year-round, but that the single ranger assigned there occasionally traveled to the main station for supplies and administrative purposes, which explained the occasional missed check-in. It was a reasonable explanation. The log showed no pattern of emergency alerts or follow-up action by other rangers, which would have been present if the missed check-ins were considered serious. So I accepted his explanation and moved forward with my audit. But I made a specific note in my documentation. The 8 missed evening check-ins should have generated secondary verification or a morning welfare check. The absence of such follow-up suggested either that the protocol was not being enforced or that the missed check-ins were expected and therefore not treated as anomalies by the staff. I did not yet know which interpretation was correct. On my third day, I scheduled a visit to the secondary ranger stations. The eastern station, which was the primary facility for the lower altitude hiking routes, was a 2-hour drive from the administration building. Tao Ming drove while I reviewed additional paperwork. The drive took us through beautiful terrain, dense forest giving way to alpine grassland. The Eastern Station was a newer structure, well-maintained, with comfortable staff quarters and modern equipment. I conducted my inspection procedures, reviewed their specific incident logs, and interviewed the 2 rangers stationed there. Everything appeared normal. They reported no unusual incidents or equipment failures. They had processed the previous month's visitor count and maintained the trail systems within their zone of responsibility. I saw nothing remarkable. When we departed the Eastern Station to return to the main administration building, Tao Ming took a different route than the one we had used to arrive. I asked about this. He explained that the eastern route required more careful driving due to recent weather damage, so he preferred the northern approach on the return journey. This made sense. As we drove, I noticed that our route took us on roads that bordered the northern section of the reserve that I had noted in the incident log. I could see high alpine meadows in the distance and the beginning of the plateau zone. The landscape was beautiful, with sparse vegetation adapted to the altitude and rocky terrain. I observed what appeared to be a ranger access road cutting into the forest at one point, clearly marked with a gate and a small sign. The sign indicated restricted access. I mentioned to Tao Ming that I would like to inspect that northern access point as part of my comprehensive audit. I said that I wanted to see how the restricted areas were being managed and to verify that the signage and barrier systems were adequate to prevent unauthorized visitor access. Tao Ming's response was immediate and firm. He said that the northern outpost and its access roads were not currently available for routine audit inspection due to ongoing maintenance. He said that Zhang Lei would need to authorize any visit to that zone, and that it would require advance notice and special preparation. I asked why special preparation was necessary for an inspection of ranger facilities. Tao Ming did not answer directly. He said that the northern areas had particular environmental hazards that required specific safety protocols, and that unauthorized or unplanned access could create risks. This response created the first definitive signal that something was not routine at Yunlong. If the northern zone had significant environmental hazards, that information should have been prominently featured in the general safety briefing I received upon arrival. It should have appeared in the reserve's official visitor materials and risk assessments. It should have been documented in the standard incident log, not buried in vague entries about psychological disorientation and memory problems. The fact that Tao Ming was now suggesting that access required special preparation and advanced authorization suggested that there was a protocol in place that was not being disclosed through normal channels. I decided not to press the issue immediately. I knew that I had formal authority to inspect all areas of the reserve, but I also knew that rangers could delay and obstruct an inspection through administrative procedures if they chose to do so. I needed to understand the situation better before revealing how much I intended to investigate. I thanked Tao Ming for the explanation and said I would schedule the northern inspection with Zhang Lei once I had completed my assessment of the Eastern Station's paperwork. That evening, I requested a private meeting with Zhang Lei to discuss the preliminary findings of my audit. I mentioned that the reserve's overall condition was good, but that I wanted to establish a comprehensive schedule for visiting all operational areas, including the northern outpost and alpine zone. I framed this as necessary to complete my audit properly. Zhang Lei listened carefully. He did not seem anxious or defensive. He simply said that the northern zone was currently undergoing environmental assessment work that had required the temporary restriction of some areas. He said that this work was routine and recommended by the Provincial Environmental Bureau. He offered to provide documentation of this assessment. He said that once that work was complete, I would be welcome to inspect the northern facilities. He suggested that I might return in approximately 2 months, when the assessment would be finished. This was technically not a refusal. It was a delay, but it was presented with such professional confidence that it functioned as a soft barrier. I accepted his offer and said that I would make plans to return in roughly 8 weeks for the follow-up inspection. I mentioned that I would note in my preliminary report that the northern zone was temporarily under assessment and that a second audit visit would be necessary to complete my evaluation. I observed Zhang Lei's reaction carefully. He did not object. He simply acknowledged that this approach was reasonable. He seemed, if anything, relieved that I had accepted the delay without confrontation. After that conversation, I had 4 more days to fill in my audit schedule. I continued reviewing documentation, interviewing staff, and inspecting the southern and western visitor facilities. Everything I examined was competently maintained and properly documented. On the surface, Yunlong was exactly what it claimed to be, a well-run nature reserve with experienced staff and good safety practices. But I was now certain that the environmental assessment work that Zhang Lei had mentioned was not routine, and that the northern zone had been deliberately removed from my inspection scope. The combination of factors, the clustered incidents, the vague incident log language, the missed evening check-ins, Tao Ming's resistance to my inspection request, and the sudden appearance of an undefined environmental assessment, created a coherent pattern. The Rangers were hiding something in the northern zone. They had protocols in place to prevent unauthorized access. They had established a plausible cover story to explain the restricted area, and they were confident enough in their position that they did not feel threatened by my audit authority. I needed to decide whether to pursue this further or to accept the delay and return in 2 months. The problem was that I was certain that returning in 2 months would simply give the Rangers time to refine their story and ensure that whatever I eventually found had been sanitized or explained away. If I wanted to learn what was actually happening in the northern zone, I needed to investigate while I was still at the reserve and while the Rangers had not had time to prepare for my scrutiny. The decision I made was not entirely rational. It was driven partly by professional curiosity and partly by the accumulating sense that I was being deliberately excluded from information that was important. On my final full day at the reserve, I told Zhang Lei that I had forgotten to inspect one of the equipment storage facilities that I had noted in the reserve's inventory. I said that I wanted to complete that task before my departure the following morning. I asked Tao Ming to help me locate it. The facility I mentioned did not actually exist. I had simply chosen a plausible-sounding name and location. When Tao Ming and I set out to find this non-existent storage facility, I directed our route toward the northern access road that I had seen from the vehicle earlier. I said that according to the reserve's map, the storage facility should be in that general direction. Tao Ming became instantly tense. He said he did not recognize the location I was describing. He suggested that I had misread the map. I insisted that we at least drive to the northern access gate to verify our location. Tao Ming refused directly. He said that the northern area was not accessible without specific authorization from Zhang Lei and that he could not take me there. I made a decision in that moment that changed the trajectory of my investigation. I said that I would find my own way back to the administration building and that I would request written authorization from Zhang Lei for access to the northern zone immediately. I also said that I expected to receive that authorization before my departure the following morning, or I would file a formal complaint with the provincial government regarding the reserve's obstruction of an official audit. This was a confrontational approach, but it was also within my authority. Tao Ming looked genuinely distressed by this ultimatum. He said that he understood my position but that Zhang Lei was not going to authorize that access, no matter what I threatened. Then he said something that I have never forgotten. There are things in those mountains that the Rangers know about, and we keep them contained because that is what we are required to do. You should not want to know what they are. That statement confirmed that my suspicions were correct. The Rangers were not simply hiding evidence of poor management or regulatory violations. They were actively concealing something that they considered dangerous. The phrasing "keep them contained" suggested that the threat was not abstract or historical but ongoing and located in a specific place. Tao Ming drove me back to the administration building. I did not make the formal complaint I had threatened. Instead, I considered my options. I was scheduled to depart the reserve the next morning at 8 a.m. in a vehicle arranged by the provincial government office. My accommodation and meals had been arranged through the ranger station. If I attempted to access the northern zone during normal hours, I would be prevented by the Rangers and could create a situation that would result in my immediate removal from the reserve with no additional information gathered. But the reserve was not a prison. Once the Rangers concluded their day and returned to the administration building for the evening, I would have access to the perimeter roads, even if the restricted areas were technically off-limits. The restraint that had been placed on my movements was administrative and social, not physical. The gates could be walked around if one was willing to trespass in the dark on unfamiliar terrain. I made the decision to conduct an unauthorized nighttime exploration of the northern access road. This was reckless and violated the explicit instructions I had received. It also violated my professional authority by using my position as an auditor to gain access to a reserve under false pretenses and then circumventing the Rangers' restrictions. These were not minor ethical problems. They were substantial professional violations that could have resulted in disciplinary action, but they seemed necessary given what I had learned. At 10 p.m., once I was certain that the staff had settled into their evening routine, I left the staff quarters and walked toward the northern access road that I had observed from the vehicle. I had not brought a flashlight, thinking that I might be more difficult to notice without one. My eyes adjusted to the moonlight as I walked, and I found the access gate without significant difficulty. It was a simple barrier, a metal beam across the road with a padlock. The gate itself was not particularly robust. The entire barrier could have been circumvented by simply pushing through the adjacent forest, but I was attempting to disturb as little as possible to avoid obvious evidence of my passage. I examined the lock. It was weathered but functional. I could not have opened it without tools. However, I noticed something immediately adjacent to the gate. The forest beside the road contained a narrow clearing, possibly a path used by animals or by rangers on foot. It was just wide enough for a person to move through without moving vegetation. I took this path, keeping the road visible through the trees, and was able to proceed past the gate without crossing the barrier itself. The access road beyond the gate was not heavily used. Moss and small plants had begun growing between the tire tracks, indicating that vehicle traffic was minimal. I followed the road upward into increasingly dense forest. The altitude was rising noticeably, and the air was becoming cooler and thinner. My breathing became slightly labored, though this was likely due to the combination of elevation and exertion, rather than any immediate danger. I had been walking for perhaps 20 minutes when I noticed something that caused me to stop. The forest ahead was displaying an unusual pattern of disturbance. Trees were broken and overturned as if something had moved through the area with significant force. The damage was old, not recent. The exposed wood was weathered and had been partially colonized by mosses and fungi. But the extent of the damage was considerable. An area spanning perhaps 30 meters on either side of the road showed this pattern of destruction. It was as if something large had thrashed through the forest repeatedly, or as if multiple incidents had occurred in the same general location. I approached the damaged area cautiously and examined the broken trees more carefully. The breaks were not clean, as might be produced by chainsaw or fire. They appeared to have been caused by blunt force, as though objects had been struck or bent with extreme violence. I noticed something else. The damage seemed to radiate from a central point, roughly 100 meters off the road into the forest. The greatest density of destruction was in that direction, with progressively less damage as one moved away from it. I decided to investigate that central point. I left the road and entered the damaged forest, moving slowly and carefully. The broken trees and debris made movement difficult, and I was concerned about encountering a hazard that would result in injury. After perhaps 5 minutes of careful movement through the destruction, I encountered something that caused me to freeze. The forest had opened into a small clearing, and in the center of that clearing was a structure. It was not a building or any kind of ranger facility. It was what appeared to be a concrete platform, perhaps 5 meters across and partially buried in the soil. The surface was heavily cracked and stained. Around the platform, the destruction was most intense. Trees immediately surrounding it had been utterly destroyed, snapped and overturned as if they had been subjected to tremendous force. What was visible of the concrete suggested that it might have been part of a larger installation, but the surrounding area did not reveal any additional structures or evidence of what had existed there previously. I approached the platform cautiously. My heart was accelerating, and I felt a mixture of curiosity and apprehension that I could not entirely explain. The concrete was cold to the touch, and I could see faint markings on its surface, possibly characters or symbols, but the damage and weathering made them illegible. I attempted to peer into the cracks, but darkness beyond suggested depth without revealing what lay underneath. As I stood on the platform examining it, I became aware of something else. The forest around me had become very quiet. The ambient sounds of insects and small animals that I had noticed during my walk up the road were absent. The silence was almost absolute. I looked up at the sky through the damaged canopy and estimated that I had been at the reserve for approximately 4 days now. Nothing I had experienced could have prepared me for what I was about to learn, because I had not yet understood what I was looking at. I heard the sound before I understood what was creating it. It was a low-frequency vibration, felt more than heard, emanating from beneath the concrete platform. The sound was steady and rhythmic, like a distant piece of machinery operating with regular pulses. The vibration was subtle enough that I might have dismissed it as imagination, except that it was accompanied by a faint pattern of small stones and dirt particles shifting on the concrete surface with each pulse. I stepped backward off the platform. The vibration continued. I moved further away, back toward the damaged forest, and the sound and vibration grew slightly fainter but did not cease entirely. I was experiencing what I can only describe as a profound sense that I was in a location where I should not be. Not in the sense of trespassing, though that was technically accurate. I meant that there was something fundamentally wrong with this place. The destruction, the platform, the sound, all of it suggested that something had occurred here that the rangers were actively and deliberately concealing. I made the decision to leave the area immediately. The platform was more evidence than I had anticipated gathering, and I did not want to risk encountering whatever might be protecting this location in the dark. I retraced my path back to the access road and continued walking upward, moving quickly. The road climbed higher into increasingly sparse vegetation, transitioning from dense forest into alpine meadow. I was now clearly above 3,000 meters elevation, and the vegetation had diminished to low scrub and grasses. The road eventually terminated at what appeared to be a small ranger outpost, a simple structure with a single window and a metal door. It was dark and appeared unoccupied, but I could see, even in the moonlight, that the area surrounding the outpost was disturbed in a manner similar to the forest below. The ground was scarred and uneven, with areas of exposed rock where vegetation had been stripped away. There were what appeared to be deep gouges in the earth, as if something had clawed or scraped at the ground repeatedly. The pattern of disturbance extended in all directions away from the outpost, covering an area perhaps 200 meters in diameter. The disturbance was most pronounced to the north of the outpost, extending into areas where the elevation increased further and the vegetation was minimal. I approached the outpost building cautiously. The door was secured with a padlock similar to the one on the access gate. The single window was high and did not provide a view of the interior. I attempted to peer through it but could see only darkness. I tried the door without success. However, I did notice something significant. The window had been recently repaired. The weathering pattern of the frame was old, but the glass and ceiling material were new. Someone had recently replaced this window. This suggested that the outpost was still in occasional use, despite appearing abandoned. I heard a sound behind me. It was the sound of movement through the scrub vegetation, something moving deliberately toward me. My heart immediately accelerated, and I pressed myself against the side of the outpost building, attempting to position myself where I might see what was approaching without being easily visible myself. The movement continued, and I heard the scrape of hooves on stone. A moment later, a single animal emerged from the darkness into the moonlight. It was a musk deer, a small species native to the high mountains of central China. The animal was probably of average size for the species, perhaps weighing 40 kilograms. It was walking directly toward the outpost building, toward me. The deer showed no fear, which was unusual for a wild animal encountering a human. More unusual, however, was the appearance of the animal. Its fur was disheveled and appeared partially burned or singed. Its left rear leg was missing below the hock. The animal was moving with obvious difficulty, placing minimal weight on the injured limb. Its eyes, reflecting the moonlight, were fixed directly on me. The deer came to within a few meters of where I stood and simply stopped. It was looking at me intently, its head slightly lowered. I did not move. The moment extended, and I felt the same sense of profound wrongness that I had experienced at the platform below. This animal was injured. This animal should have fled from my presence. Instead, it was approaching me deliberately. I realized that the animal was possibly seeking help, or it was trying to warn me of something. The interpretation that seemed most likely, given the context, was the latter. I began moving away from the outpost, moving toward the lower elevation areas, down the access road. The deer did not follow. It watched me as I walked away, remaining in place beside the building. I moved quickly, no longer concerned about stealth or minimizing my presence. I wanted to leave this area. I wanted to return to the administration building. I wanted to leave the reserve. It took me perhaps 15 minutes to return to the access gate. I passed through the same clearing that bypassed the barrier and descended back into the dense forest. The forest was now familiar enough that I could move more confidently, and I reached my quarters at approximately 1 a.m. I had not encountered any rangers during my journey, and no one appeared to have noticed my absence, but I had learned something critical. Whatever was being hidden in the northern zone was substantial enough to require ongoing maintenance and ranger presence. The destroyed forest, the mysterious platform, the strange sound emanating from beneath it, the injured deer, the recently replaced window at the outpost, all of these elements suggested that something was present in those mountains that required active management and concealment. I did not yet understand what it was or what it did, but I was now certain that the gaps in the incident log and the psychological distress mentioned in the ranger documentation were directly related to the northern zone and the secret it contained. I did not attempt to sleep that night. I lay in my quarters and reviewed everything I had observed, attempting to construct a coherent explanation. The most likely possibilities seemed to be: 1. There was an environmental hazard, something like a gas vent or radioactive source that was causing the psychological and physical effects described in the incident log. The platform might be monitoring or containing this hazard. 2. There was an animal population that had become dangerous or unpredictable, and the rangers were attempting to manage it by restricting access and preventing public knowledge of the danger. 3. There was something on the platform itself, something that had caused the destruction around it and that produced the vibration and sound I had heard. This was the least likely explanation, the one that required the most speculative thinking, but the evidence of the deep gouges and the extensive destruction suggested something more active than a simple environmental feature. None of these explanations were satisfactory. Each raised more questions than it answered. But I knew that I needed to report what I had discovered to someone outside the Ranger administration. If the Rangers were concealing something dangerous, the provincial government needed to know about it. If they were concealing something else, environmental damage, safety violations, regulatory non-compliance that also needed to be reported. I departed the reserve at 8 a.m. as scheduled. Zhang Lei saw me off at the main building, thanking me for my inspection and expressing confidence that my preliminary report would reflect the reserve's good management. I assured him that I would note the environmental assessment work and that my follow-up inspection would be scheduled within 8 weeks. We shook hands professionally, but I did not return to the provincial government office directly. Instead, I diverted to the Regional Environmental Protection Bureau and filed a formal request for the records of any environmental assessment work currently being conducted at Yunlong Nature Reserve. The official I spoke with, a woman named Lu Feng, was initially uncommunicative. She said that the information I was requesting was not in the Bureau's public records. When I pressed, citing my audit authority, she eventually said that no environmental assessment work was currently recorded in the Bureau's database for Yunlong. The rangers claimed that the environmental assessment was authorized and recommended by the Provincial Environmental Bureau was false. This confirmation that Zhang Lei had deliberately lied to me changed the situation significantly. The northern zone was not closed due to legitimate government work. It was closed because the rangers themselves had decided that it needed to be restricted. That suggested that they were concealing something for which they had no official authorization or oversight. I returned to my office and drafted my preliminary audit report. In it I documented every procedural issue I had observed, the missed evening check-ins, the vague incident log entries, the geographical clustering of incidents in the northern zone, and most importantly, the false claim about the environmental assessment. I also included a note that my audit of the northern facilities could not be completed due to access restrictions, and that a second inspection visit would be necessary. I did not mention my unauthorized nighttime exploration, the destroyed forest, the platform, or the injured deer. That information was not officially part of my audit, and including it would have undermined the credibility of my formal report. The report was submitted to the provincial government. I received a response 2 weeks later asking me to schedule a follow-up inspection at Yunlong, and to provide additional details about the access restrictions that had prevented me from completing my audit. I scheduled the follow-up visit for exactly 8 weeks after my initial departure, as I had promised Zhang Lei, but I requested that the provincial government send an additional official, preferably an environmental specialist and a wildlife officer, to accompany me. The time between my first and second visit to Yunlong was 8 weeks of investigation conducted from my office in Kunming. I reviewed every publicly available record related to the reserve. I studied maps and satellite imagery of the northern zone, attempting to identify the location of the platform. I obtained historical records of the reserve's operations, and I began interviewing people who had visited or worked at Yunlong during the periods when incidents had occurred. The most significant discovery during this research was historical. Yunlong Nature Reserve had not always been in its current location and had not always served its current purpose. Before 1994, when it was established as a wildlife reserve, the land had been used for other purposes. By examining older maps and records, I found that during the 1980s there had been a small research facility in the northern mountains, established by a geology department at a university in Kunming. The facility had been studying mineral deposits and subsurface geological formations in the area. The purpose of the research had not been explicitly detailed in any public record, but the location of the facility, based on the historical map coordinates, corresponded closely to where I had found the concrete platform. I could not determine what had happened to that facility or why it had been abandoned. The record simply ended in 1988. The facility was not mentioned in any documentation related to the establishment of the nature reserve in 1994. It was as if it had been erased from official history. I also attempted to interview several tourists who had been affected by incidents at Yunlong during the past 2 years. This proved difficult. Their contact information was limited, and some of them, when I did manage to reach them, were reluctant to discuss their experiences. The German photographer who had been evacuated due to acute altitude sickness was more forthcoming than the others. When I reached him by phone, he initially denied that he had been affected by anything unusual at Yunlong. But when I mentioned specific details from the incident log, he became quiet. He eventually said that he was not comfortable discussing what had happened at the reserve. He said that after his evacuation, he had been contacted by someone associated with the reserve who had advised him not to file any formal complaint, and who had suggested that discussing his experience with outside parties would be inadvisable. Someone had discouraged him from talking about this. He hung up the phone before I could ask further questions. None of the other tourists I contacted were willing to discuss their experiences either. But the fact that they had apparently been contacted and warned against publicity suggested that Zhang Lei and the other rangers had established some kind of management protocol for the people affected by whatever was in the northern zone. They were ensuring silence through a combination of social pressure and informal threats. When I arrived at Yunlong for my second inspection visit, 8 weeks after my initial departure, the situation had changed noticeably. I was now accompanied by Dr. Lin Chang, an environmental specialist from the provincial government, and Officer Wang Hai, a wildlife official from the Regional Forestry Bureau. Zhang Lei greeted us politely but with noticeably less warmth than during my first visit. He said that he understood why the provincial government had requested a more thorough inspection but that some areas of the reserve were still not immediately accessible due to ongoing maintenance work. The routine of deflection and delay was repeating itself. However, this time I did not accept the restriction. I informed Zhang Lei that the provincial government had specifically requested inspection of all areas of the reserve, and that the environmental assessment work he had mentioned during my first visit could not be corroborated with the Environmental Protection Bureau. I said that according to government records, no such assessment had been authorized. I stated that I would be conducting a thorough inspection of the northern zone regardless of any claimed maintenance work. Zhang Lei's expression changed. For a moment he appeared genuinely afraid. Then he composed himself and said that he understood my position, but that I needed to wait for him to make some preparations before I proceeded to the northern areas. He disappeared into his office and made a phone call. Through the office window I could see that the conversation was serious. When he emerged, he said that his superiors had agreed to allow the inspection but that certain precautions would be necessary. He would personally accompany us to the northern zone, and we would need to follow specific protocols regarding areas we could access and photographs we could take. He said this was for our safety and for compliance with reserve regulations regarding sensitive research areas. Dr. Lin and Officer Wang agreed to these conditions. I knew that this represented a significant change in Zhang Lei's position. He was no longer simply refusing access. He was facilitating it, but with restrictions. This suggested that someone higher in the administrative chain had decided that completely refusing the provincial government's inspection was less damaging than allowing controlled access. We departed early the next morning, driving to the northern access gate. Zhang Lei used a key to open the padlock, and we proceeded up the access road. As we drove, Zhang Lei explained that the reserve was conducting research on subsurface geological phenomena that had implications for the safety of both the reserve staff and its visitors. He said that some visitors had been exposed to these phenomena in the past and had experienced temporary neurological effects as a result. He said that the reserve was working with the government to understand and manage this hazard. This was the first time that Zhang Lei had been anything approaching candid about what was happening in the northern zone. It was also a controlled admission designed to frame the phenomenon as a known and manageable geological issue rather than as something more mysterious or threatening. When I asked what specific geological phenomena he was referring to, he was vague. He said it involved subsurface atmospheric conditions and suggested that our specialized expertise might be helpful in developing a better understanding of the situation. We proceeded on foot from the point where the road became too deteriorated to drive. Zhang Lei led us directly toward the platform I had discovered on my unauthorized excursion. The platform was now in daylight, and I could see it far more clearly than I had under moonlight. It was perhaps 6 meters across and appeared to be a structure with significant depth below ground level. The visible concrete was heavily deteriorated, with deep cracks extending across the entire surface. But what was most striking was what I now observed about the surrounding forest. The destruction was even more extensive than I had recognized during my nighttime visit. Trees within approximately 50 meters of the platform showed evidence of violent damage, but more significant was the pattern of the damage. It radiated outward from the platform as if the platform itself was the source of some destructive force. The force had acted repeatedly. There were concentric rings of destruction, with the most severe damage immediately adjacent to the platform and progressively less severe damage extending outward. Dr. Lin knelt down and examined the exposed concrete closely. He asked Zhang Lei directly whether this structure predated the establishment of the nature reserve. Zhang Lei hesitated before responding. He said that yes, the structure was from a previous era. He said that it had been an experimental facility related to geological research. He said that it had been abandoned decades ago, and that it was currently being monitored to ensure it did not pose environmental or safety risks. I asked him what kind of experimental facility. Zhang Lei gave a non-answer, saying that historical research objectives were not particularly relevant to the current management situation. What mattered, he said, was understanding the current hazard and implementing protocols to prevent visitors from being exposed to it. Officer Wang, meanwhile, had walked around the perimeter of the platform and was examining the ground patterns. He called out to us that he had found animal remains. I walked over to where he was standing. In the grass, partially buried but still visible, were the skeletal remains of multiple animals. There was a musk deer skeleton, similar to the injured deer I had encountered weeks earlier. There were also the remains of what appeared to be a wild boar, a golden monkey, and at least 2 other animals that I could not immediately identify. The bones were in various states of decomposition and weathering, suggesting that these animals had died at different times. Several of the skeletons showed evidence of extreme trauma. Bone fragments were scattered rather than articulated, as if the animals had been subjected to violent force or impact. Zhang Lei's response to the discovery of these animal remains was to become more explicit about the nature of the threat. He said with obvious reluctance that there was a phenomenon emanating from the platform that was affecting local wildlife. He said that animals in the immediate vicinity of the platform appeared to behave abnormally and were being injured or killed by forces he could not entirely explain. He said that human visitors who entered the zone had reported psychological symptoms, memory loss and disorientation. He said that the reserve was monitoring the situation but did not understand its cause. He said that the decision to restrict access to the northern zone was a precautionary measure designed to prevent further harm. This admission represented a significant shift. Zhang Lei was now confirming the existence of an active, ongoing hazard. He was admitting that the Rangers had been concealing it. He was not fully explaining what it was, but he was acknowledging that it was real and that it was dangerous. I asked him directly whether he believed the hazard was related to the platform structure. He looked at the platform for a long time before responding. He said that he believed the platform was either the source of the hazard or was monitoring and possibly containing it. He said that if the platform had been disturbed or damaged, the hazard might be intensifying. He said that in the past 2 years the signs of activity had increased. More animals were being found in the area. More visitors had reported symptoms even at greater distances from the platform. He said that the reserve had filed 2 confidential reports with the provincial government requesting guidance and assistance in managing the situation, but that no response had been provided. This last statement was significant. The reserve had requested help from the provincial government and had been ignored. That raised the question of who at the provincial level knew about this situation and why they had not acted on it. We remained at the platform for approximately 30 minutes while Dr. Lin collected samples and examined the structure carefully. He was particularly interested in the cracks and the visible fissures, and he took measurements and photographs. At one point he asked whether anyone else had examined the structure during the past few years. Zhang Lei said that a geologist had visited the site approximately 18 months earlier to collect samples and conduct analysis, but that the results of that analysis were unknown to him. The geologist had been contracted through the Provincial Environmental Protection Bureau. I realized in that moment that there was a government official or agency that knew far more about this situation than had been disclosed to me. Someone in the provincial government had hired a geologist to investigate the platform and had received some kind of report about it. That information had not been shared with either the reserve's administrative chain or with my audit department. We returned to the administration building in the late afternoon. That evening I requested a private meeting with Zhang Lei. I asked him who specifically he had contacted at the provincial government regarding the Northern Zone hazard. He provided me with a name, Director Wu Hui from the Provincial Department of Natural Resources and Environmental Management. Director Wu had received the confidential reports that Zhang Lei mentioned. According to Zhang Lei, Director Wu had authorized the restriction of the Northern Zone and had instructed the reserve to maintain strict confidentiality about the situation pending further investigation. I understood now that I was not investigating a local anomaly. I was uncovering something that extended into the provincial administration. Someone at the government level had decided that this information should not be disclosed through normal channels, including to the provincial audit department. That suggested either that the situation was being properly managed through confidential procedures, or that someone had improperly classified information that should have been disclosed through normal government processes. I spent that evening on my phone with Dr. Lin and Officer Wang, discussing what we had learned. Dr. Lin said that the platform clearly predated the nature reserve by several decades, and that it bore the hallmarks of an experimental facility from the 1980s. He said that the type of destruction visible in the surrounding forest was consistent with repeated exposure to high-energy phenomena, such as strong vibration, acoustic energy, or radiation. He said that without proper analysis of the structure and the surrounding environment, he could not determine what specifically was causing the observed effects. Officer Wang said that the animal remains were concerning from a wildlife management perspective. If something in the Northern Zone was killing animals in significant numbers, that information needed to be incorporated into the reserve's management plan. He said that the reserve's apparent decision to simply restrict access rather than to determine the cause and address it was an inadequate response. I made the decision to contact Director Wu Hui directly the following morning. I called his office and requested a meeting. His assistant said that he was not currently available, but that he could schedule me for a meeting in approximately 1 week. I said that this was regarding a sensitive environmental and safety matter at Yunlong Nature Reserve, and that it required urgent attention. The assistant placed me on hold, and then returned to say that Director Wu could meet with me 3 days hence. 3 days later, I sat in Director Wu's office in the provincial capital. His demeanor was not hostile, but it was guarded. I explained what I had observed at Yunlong, and what Zhang Lei had admitted regarding the northern zone hazard. I asked him directly whether the provincial government was aware of this situation, and what action was being taken to address it. Director Wu listened carefully. He then said in a measured tone that yes, he was aware of the situation at Yunlong. He said that the matter was currently under investigation by appropriate agencies and that it would be inadvisable for me to proceed with any public reporting or further investigation of my own. He said that the confidential reports filed by the reserve were part of a larger inquiry into certain historical installations that predated the nature reserve. He said that the information could not be disclosed to audit departments or to other government agencies pending completion of that investigation. I asked him whether there was a health or safety risk to the public. He said that the risk was being minimized through access restrictions, and that he was confident that no further incidents would occur if those restrictions remained in place. I asked him whether there was danger to the rangers who worked at the reserve, given that they were occasionally exposed to the northern zone. He did not answer that question directly. I realized that I had reached the end of what I could accomplish through official channels. Director Wu had made it clear that I was not to pursue this further. He had authority to ensure that my audit findings were properly filed, and that any official response followed the established procedures. But he had also, through his manner and his instructions, indicated that there were things about this situation that I was not authorized to know. I returned to my office and drafted my official follow-up audit report. In that report I documented that the northern zone had required access restrictions due to environmental hazards, that these restrictions appeared to be in place per provincial government authorization, and that further investigation into the specific nature of the hazards would require coordination with the Provincial Department of Natural Resources. I noted that the reserve's management of the restriction appeared appropriate, given the constraints they were operating under. My report concluded by stating that the audit could not be fully completed without access to the restricted areas and recommended that future audits address this limitation. This report was technically accurate but functionally evasive. It allowed the situation to continue without forcing any disclosure or immediate action. It also protected me from the professional consequences that might have resulted from either making unfounded allegations or from reporting information that I had been explicitly told not to disclose. In the 3 years since that second visit to Yunlong, I have not returned to the reserve. I have continued my work as an audit inspector, visiting other reserves and parks throughout Yunnan province. I have never attempted to contact Zhang Lei or any other ranger from Yunlong. I have not attempted to contact the geologist who was hired to investigate the platform. I have accepted perhaps too easily the boundary that Director Wu established regarding what I should know about the situation, but I have changed in ways that are more subtle than avoiding a specific location. I think about that platform regularly. I think about the injured musk deer and the bones of the animals surrounding the structure. I think about the vibration and sound that I felt emanating from beneath the concrete. I think about what an experimental facility in the 1980s might have been studying in those mountains, and what kind of phenomena might persist for decades after the facility was supposedly abandoned. I think about why the provincial government decided that this information should be restricted, and what would have changed in their assessment by this point, 3 years later. Most significantly, I have come to believe that I did not actually discover this secret. I was allowed to discover it. Zhang Lei's initial resistance to my inspecting the northern zone gave way remarkably quickly once the provincial government became involved. Director Wu's authoritative but not hostile response suggested that there was an established procedure for handling auditors who learned about the situation. I was not being denied information because I lacked authority to access it. I was being handled in a way that ensured my compliance with the restricted information protocols without requiring any explicit enforcement action. The question that remains unanswered, 3 years later, is what, specifically, was being investigated in those mountains? What kind of phenomenon persists at that site? And what is the current status of the platform in the northern zone? I will likely never know the answer, because the people who possess that information have decided that it should remain classified. But I know with certainty that something is present in the mountains of Yunlong, that the rangers have been assigned to contain or monitor it, and that the provincial government has determined that the risk of the secret being revealed is less than the risk of attempting to remove whatever is at that site, or fully explaining it to the public. I am telling this story now because I believe the threshold for maintaining such secrets has changed. The incident at Yunlong occurred over 3 years ago. Whatever situation prompted the platform's construction and its subsequent monitoring has had decades to develop. If the phenomenon was stable enough to be contained through access restrictions alone, the rangers would not be as concerned as they appeared when I confronted them with my discoveries. The fact that Zhang Lei mentioned increasing signs of activity in the 2 years prior to my inspection suggests that the situation may be destabilizing. The second reason I am speaking about this is more personal. I will not go back to Yunlong. I will not attempt to verify the current status of the platform or the condition of the northern zone. I have accepted the boundaries that the government has established. But I want someone to know what I discovered, and I want that information to exist outside of the classified files and confidential reports that are contained in provincial government buildings. If something happens at Yunlong in the future, if the access restrictions fail, or if something emerges from the northern zone, this account will provide context for understanding why the event occurred, and why certain people were aware of the danger and chose not to disclose it publicly. I found the ledger in my grandmother's house 3 weeks after the funeral, in a room we had collectively decided not to enter for 40 years. That is how you know something needs to stay hidden, when every member of a family, without ever discussing it, simply does not go there. The room was my grandfather's study. He had died in 1982, almost before I was born. My grandmother had kept everything the way he left it. Desk, lamp, filing cabinets, a single framed photograph of the two of them from 1965, and a leather-bound ledger on a shelf behind books about geology and forestry. I was supposed to be boxing up paperwork. The ledger was not supposed to matter. The first page had dates. Dozens of dates spanning from 1963 to 2003. Each date had initials and numbers. My grandfather's initials appeared first. Then, starting in 1966, other initials began appearing. Names I recognized. Families I had grown up seeing at community events on Quarry Mountain, where my family had lived for 6 generations. By the second page I stopped treating it as a casual document. This was a record, a log. And whatever it was tracking, someone had maintained it for 40 years with enough care that every entry was neat, consistent, and written in fountain pen. If you're listening because stories like this won't let you sleep easily, subscribe and stick with me, because I am going to explain exactly what I found, and why 4 families decided to keep the same secret across 4 decades, raising children who never knew, marrying people who never asked, and living on the same mountain without ever allowing the truth to surface. My name is Marcus Webb. I teach environmental history at the University of Montana. Before that I spent 12 years as a genealogist, working primarily with Appalachian and Rocky Mountain families. I know how to read land records, birth certificates, probate documents, and handwriting from different decades. I understand the psychology of why families keep secrets, and I recognize the architecture of organized silence. What I found in that ledger changed my understanding of my own family's history, and it led me to 3 other families on Quarry Mountain who had been protecting the same mystery. Quarry Mountain is not the mountain's real name. It is a working granite and feldspar quarry located in the northern highlands of western North Carolina, about 30 miles from the Tennessee border. The quarry is massive, but it occupies only about 400 acres. The remainder of the mountain, roughly 2,000 acres, is private land, divided into 6 family properties that have remained relatively intact for over a century. My family owns one, the Hendersons own another, the Carpenters, the Ramseys, and the Claytons held the remaining parcels. During the early 1960s, my grandfather built the house where I grew up. He was a geologist by training, worked for the U.S. Geological Survey, and chose Quarry Mountain specifically because of the rock formations and the isolation. My grandmother came from a prominent local family. They settled into a quiet existence, raising 2 children, and by all accounts lived an unremarkable life for a man in his profession. In 1963, something changed. I do not have direct evidence of what happened that year. What I have is the beginning of the ledger and my grandfather's sudden shift toward extreme privacy. He had been a social man before then. According to my mother's memories, he started refusing invitations. He installed gates at the property entrance. He began working from home more than his USGS position normally required. Between 1963 and 1965, he made contact with the other families, the Hendersons, the Carpenters, the Ramseys, the Claytons. All of them lived on Quarry Mountain. All of them had noticed something wrong. The ledger begins with the words, March 15, 1963, first documented sighting. Eastern slope, near the abandoned quarry access road, height estimated 6 to 7 feet, bipedal, canine features, color dark gray to black, tracks found, measurements recorded, direction of travel, toward lower elevation northwest. That is my grandfather's handwriting. That is also the beginning of a 40-year documentation of an animal that should not exist, a pact between 5 families to keep silent about it, and a system of feeding it that they believed would keep it away from their homes. The creature was called the Quarry Dogman in the ledger, though never in conversation, I would later learn. Spoken language leaves evidence. Written records can be controlled. By the time I pieced this together, the families had moved beyond writing anything down at all. The tradition had simply become part of the mountain's rhythm, something understood but unspoken, like an old house rule that everyone follows without remembering when it was established. My grandfather's initial observation came while he was surveying geological samples in the eastern section of the property. He had found massive paw prints near an abandoned quarry access road. Not bear, not mountain lion, something larger, with a different gait pattern. He measured them carefully, 18 inches long, 7 inches wide across the pad, claws extending another 2 inches. The prints showed signs of bipedal walking, weight distributed across the ball of the foot rather than the full pad, which is how bears walk, and they were fresh. The rain from the previous evening had nearly filled them. He also found scat. He collected a sample and had it analyzed under the pretense of the USGS work. The analysis came back inconclusive. The sample was consistent with a large canine predator, possibly a wolf, though wolves had not been seen in North Carolina for over a century. The analysis noted anomalous protein structures that do not match known canine species. My grandfather did not report this to his USGS supervisors. Instead, he began investigating the sightings privately. For the next 2 years, he kept detailed records. Sightings from his property. Sightings from adjacent land. Strange vocalizations heard in the early morning. Deep, prolonged sounds that he described as neither canine nor feline but containing elements of both. Livestock disappearances from properties as far as 5 miles away. Missing dogs from the general area. And always when he investigated, he found evidence that supported the presence of a large intelligent predator. Between 1963 and 1965 he made his contacts. The first was Henry Henderson, who lived half a mile to the north. Henderson had witnessed the creature directly during the summer of 1964. He had been at his livestock enclosure at dusk when he saw a massive dark figure moving through the pine stands at the property line. He described the same characteristics my grandfather had noted. Bipedal stance, canine features, extraordinary size. Henderson had grabbed his rifle and fired at it. He hit nothing. The creature moved faster than he could track. By the time Henderson reported this to my grandfather, he was terrified. He had stopped letting his children outside alone. He had changed his entire daily routine around the fear of another encounter, and he did not want his experience to become public knowledge, because he understood, as my grandfather understood, that no one would believe him. The second contact was Robert Carpenter, who lived on the western slope. Carpenter was a wildlife biologist, trained at Duke, and initially skeptical of my grandfather's claims. But Carpenter had also found tracks. He had also heard the vocalizations. And when he analyzed the description against known cryptozoological reports, he found a disturbing pattern. Sightings matching this creature's description had been reported in the Appalachian region since the 1890s, never frequently, never in the same location for long, but consistently enough that Carpenter was forced to conclude either that multiple people across generations were misidentifying known animals, or that something genuinely anomalous was present in the range. The Ramseys came next, then the Claytons. All of them had encountered something. All of them had evidence, and all of them were terrified of public exposure, both of the creature and of their own experiences. By late 1965, the 5 families had established the first agreement. The creature was to be monitored but not hunted. Reports were to be documented and shared only among the 5 families, and to the best of their ability, they would attempt to keep the animal away from human settlement through a system of feeding it, leaving food in specific locations on the highest, most isolated parts of the mountain. The theory, according to a note from my grandfather dated November 1965, was this. If the creature was truly a large predator adapted to the region, it would require regular feeding. A starving predator becomes an aggressive one. By controlling its food supply, they could theoretically direct its activity and reduce the likelihood of dangerous encounters with people. The feeding sites would also allow them to continue monitoring the creature without the risk of direct confrontation. It was, I have come to understand, a compromise between 2 impossible options: kill it or accept it. They chose the third path that necessity had created: management. The ledger's first 3 years are dedicated to establishing protocol, testing feeding sites, recording what the creature ate and in what quantity, noting seasonal patterns, documenting its movements and range. My grandfather and Robert Carpenter had worked out a rough map of its territory based on sighting locations and track evidence. It ranged across approximately 800 acres, moving between the northern and southern ridges seasonally, though the pattern was not entirely predictable. Then in 1968, something changed again. The Clayton's daughter, who was 8 years old at the time, nearly encountered the creature at the property line. She had been playing in the afternoon, moving beyond the designated safety area of the house, when the family dog began barking violently at the tree line. The girl's mother, hearing the commotion, ran outside and found her daughter standing frozen, facing a massive dark shape partially obscured by pine branches. The mother grabbed her daughter and ran. The creature did not pursue. But the message was clear. The feeding program was not containing the creature as intended. The families convened. According to notes from my grandfather's journal, the meeting was held in Carpenter's home, and it was contentious. Some family members wanted to organize a hunt. Others wanted to involve authorities, but there was a deeper problem. Any official involvement would require explanation. The creature's existence would become public. And public knowledge meant public fear, public investigation, and potentially the end of the family's collective control over the situation. Henderson proposed an alternative. Increase the feeding rations. Distribute them across a wider range of sites, particularly in the northern sector of the mountain, away from the residential areas. Create a perimeter, defined by the feeding sites themselves, that would encourage the creature to stay within a bounded territory. It was more intensive than the original plan. It would require active participation from all 5 families, but it might work. They voted. The decision was unanimous. The program would expand. From 1968 onward, the ledger begins to show the names of all 5 families appearing in regular rotation. The feeding occurred twice a month, always at night, always at predetermined locations. My grandfather's entries become less narrative and more strictly procedural. Date, family responsible, food items delivered, quantity, weather conditions, animal signs observed in the preceding 2 weeks. The handwriting becomes more compact. The notes become technical. This was a working document now, a log maintained by people who had moved past fear and into routine. But that is the strange thing about any long-term secret kept by a community. It eventually stops feeling like a secret. It becomes ordinary. Over the next decade, the practice continued. The feeding sites were refined. Routes were established to minimize time spent on the mountain during the feeding operations. Equipment was cached at specific points, coolers, tools, records, maintained by a rotating schedule that ensured constant upkeep but distributed the labor fairly. My grandfather began training my mother to recognize the territory landmarks, though she was never told why. The other families did the same with their children, passing down geographic knowledge without context. By the late 1970s, the second generation was beginning to reach adulthood. My mother was in college. Henry Henderson's eldest son was in the Army. Robert Carpenter's daughter had moved to Atlanta. The creature had never killed anyone. It had never seriously attacked anyone, aside from that single 1968 incident when it had approached the Claytons' property line. The feeding program was working, apparently. The mountain remained stable. The secret remained contained. Between 1978 and 1998, the ledger shows evidence of complacency. Entries become more sporadic. Not every feeding is recorded. When entries do appear, they are often brief. My grandfather retired from the USGS in 1984 and seemed to transfer most of his responsibility to Henderson and Carpenter. New handwriting begins appearing. The sons and daughters who had grown up on Quarry Mountain, who had been taught the routes and the landmarks, and who now understood that something lived on their mountain, and that their family had made a choice to live alongside it. There is one entry from my grandfather dated March 1982. It is his last in the ledger. The creature is now a permanent part of this mountain's ecology, whether natural or otherwise. Our responsibility is no longer to eliminate it or to study it, but to maintain the boundary between its territory and ours. We have done this successfully for 19 years. If the next generation continues the practice with the same discipline, there is no reason this arrangement cannot endure indefinitely. How is Maine beyond? He died that same year, in May. I was born 2 months later. My mother never told me about the ledger. She never told me about the feeding sites or the creature or the agreement between the families. I grew up on Quarry Mountain not knowing that my parents, during my childhood, were making midnight trips into the northern forest to leave dead deer and other game in marked locations. It was not until I found the ledger that I began to understand why my mother had always insisted on strict boundaries for my exploration of our property. Why certain areas of the mountain were explicitly off limits. Why I was taught early to stay on marked trails and to return to the house before dusk. And why on several occasions during my childhood, I had seen my mother or father leaving the house at unusual hours with bags of something, neither returning nor explaining where they had been. When I called my mother after finding the ledger, she did not deny anything. She simply asked me to come to her house, bring the ledger, and we would talk. The conversation lasted 9 hours. She explained everything in a way that made clear she had been waiting for this moment, that she knew eventually the secret would need to be passed down or disclosed. She explained the family's reasoning, the feeding program, the logic of the boundary management system. She explained that the creature had never become violent, that it seemed to understand the feeding was a form of arrangement, and that the families believed they had achieved a genuine equilibrium, a situation where a mysterious predator and human families could coexist because the predator had been given a reason to stay away. "Why didn't you tell me?" I asked her. "Because you left," she said. "You went to college in Missoula, you became a genealogist, you built a life outside the mountain, and I thought maybe that was better. I thought maybe your generation didn't need to carry this. Does anyone else know? The families know, all of them, the children now adults like you, some of the spouses. But nobody talks about it. Not in a way that leaves evidence, not in a way that enters the public world. What does it eat? Game, primarily. Deer, elk when we can acquire them. We also provide it with livestock that fails inspection, meat from slaughterhouses, anything that would otherwise be wasted. The ledger will show you the feeding schedule and the quantities. Your grandfather was very precise about this. He wanted to make sure we understood exactly how much protein would be required to sustain a creature of that size in a regional climate. Has anyone ever seen it directly since 1968? As my mother hesitated. That hesitation told me that the answer was yes, and that there were incidents beyond what appeared in the ledger. In 1992, she said finally, Robert Carpenter saw it, not at the perimeter, at one of the feeding sites themselves. He had been delayed during a feeding operation and arrived later than planned. The creature was already there, waiting. He said it was aware of him, that it watched him while he left the food and backed away. He said they made eye contact, and for a moment he was absolutely certain it could think, that it understood the arrangement we had made. Did he report that? Not officially, he told the other families. It was recorded, I believe, in a separate document, not in your grandfather's ledger, because your grandfather was already dead by then. But there was another log. After your grandfather passed, the families kept a different kind of record. Less detailed, more cautious. They knew by then that anything written down could be discovered. Where is that record? I do not know, my mother said. That is not something I was given access to. Once I married your father and began raising you, my involvement in the program began to diminish. My role had always been maintenance, keeping the feeding sites stocked, recording observations. But once there was a child in the house, the families seemed to decide I should focus on that instead. Does this still happen? Are they still feeding it? My mother looked uncomfortable. I do not know. It has been years since I was directly involved. But I assume the arrangement continues. The families are still there. The mountain is still there. And there has never been an incident serious enough to force a reckoning. I left her house with the ledger and a head full of questions that I knew could only be answered by contacting the other families. I was not certain they would speak to me. I was not certain they would even acknowledge my knowledge of what had been done. But I had to try. The first person I contacted was David Henderson. He is the son of Henry Henderson, the man who had witnessed the creature in 1964, and first brought the evidence to my grandfather. David is a timber contractor now, lives about 10 miles from Quarry Mountain, and I found his contact information through a business license search. I called him and explained, briefly, that I had found my grandfather's ledger, and that I needed to talk to someone about what was documented inside. There was a long silence. Then he said, "Have you told anyone else?" "No. Keep it that way. Give me 2 days." 2 days later, David called me back. He gave me a time and a location, a diner in a town 15 miles from the mountain, and asked me to bring the ledger. When I arrived at the diner, David was already seated in a back booth. He was a man in his mid-50s, weathered, with the hands of someone who spent most of his life working outdoors. He ordered coffee and asked me to show him the ledger. I opened it to a page showing his father's handwriting. Henry Henderson's entries spanned from 1964 to 1987, when his health began to decline. David looked at the entries for several minutes without speaking. Then he closed the ledger carefully and slid it back across the table to me. "My father wanted to destroy that," he said. "He told my uncle before he died that your grandfather had been too meticulous, that written records were a liability to all of us. But your grandfather refused. He said the documentation was necessary, that if anything ever happened there needed to be a clear record that the families had acted responsibly, that we were not ignorant of what we were doing or negligent in managing it." "Is your uncle still alive?" "No. He died in 2001. "I need to understand what happened after 1982, I said. My grandfather stopped recording. The ledger ends with his final entry, but the feeding clearly continued. I need to know who was maintaining the records and what was actually happening on the mountain. David leaned back in his booth and studied me. Why do you need to know this? Because it's the truth about my family. Because it's the truth about a place I grew up. Because there's a living animal on that mountain that has been sustained by 5 families for 60 years, and I think people deserve to understand why. People deserve to understand, David repeated. No, people deserve to feel safe. People deserve to live their lives without fear. The arrangement we have maintained has kept this mountain safe and kept this creature, whatever it is, contained and managed. The moment that information enters the public world, everything changes. There will be investigations, there will be hunters. There will be environmental agencies and news crews and tourists with cameras. That creature will either be killed or it will leave, and if it leaves it becomes everyone else's problem. So you're asking me not to tell anyone. I am telling you that if you do, you will break the trust that 5 families have maintained for 40 years. You will betray people who have spent their lives protecting both their homes and an animal that by any rational standard should not exist and should be destroyed on sight. Who maintains the records now? David was quiet for a long time. Then he said, there is a person, someone from outside the families. We brought them in during the 1990s because the families were beginning to fragment. People were moving away, people were dying. We needed someone who could maintain the program long term without the emotional attachments that were starting to cause problems. This person is compensated. They are bound by legal agreement. They understand the stakes. Who? I cannot tell you. Part of the agreement is that even I do not have direct contact with them. Payments are made through an intermediary. Records are minimal. What you are looking at with your grandfather's ledger, that is the end of the transparent era. After 1982 the program became compartmentalized. I drove back to my grandfather's house that evening with the ledger and the growing realization that the secret I had discovered went much deeper than a simple 1960s pact between neighbors. The families had evolved their protection of the creature into something more sophisticated, more hidden, and more deliberately structured to resist discovery. Over the next 6 months I made contact with the other families. Robert Carpenter had died in 2006, but his daughter Susan Carpenter agreed to meet with me. She told me that her father had been documenting his own observations in a separate journal, one that he kept in a safe deposit box. After his death, that journal had been destroyed by her mother, as per his instructions. But before it was destroyed, Susan had photographed several pages. He was fascinated by it, Susan told me. Not afraid, like the others. Fascinated. He wanted to understand what it was. He had theories about mutation, about adaptation, about the possibility that something had changed in the Appalachian Mountains that science had not yet catalogued. He believed if we could contain the creature long enough, we might eventually understand its origin. The Ramseys were more cautious. I met with Thomas Ramsey, who had taken over his family's role in the feeding program in the 1980s. He refused to provide any information about the current state of the program or the creature's current behavior. He simply told me that if I publicized any of this, the families would lawyer up and make my life considerably more difficult. The Claytons agreed to meet with me, but only in the presence of a lawyer. That meeting was brief and revealed nothing. After those encounters, I understood that I had reached the limit of what I could discover through direct contact. The families were not going to provide me with additional records or information. They were united in their commitment to protecting the secret, and they saw me as a threat to that arrangement. So I did what genealogists do. I researched. I obtained property records going back to the 1950s. I examined historical deeds and transfers. I looked for evidence of unusual expenses or transactions that might suggest the scale of the feeding program. I contacted the State Wildlife Agency and asked about historical reports of missing livestock or predator incidents on Quarry Mountain. I searched newspaper archives for any reference to unusual animal sightings in the region during the 1960s and 1970s. What emerged was a pattern that I probably should have noticed earlier. There were exactly 0 published reports of anything unusual on Quarry Mountain after 1962. Before that year there had been occasional reports, missing livestock, hunters reporting strange tracks, that sort of thing. But after 1962 it was as if the mountain had become completely unremarkable in the official record. This is not how nature typically works. Real predators, real evidence of predators, eventually becomes impossible to completely conceal. But the families, through discipline and isolation, had achieved something remarkable. They had created an informational dead zone around Quarry Mountain that lasted for 60 years. That dead zone broke, ironically, because of genetics. In 2015, a genetic researcher from Duke University was studying population genetics in the southern Appalachian Mountains. As part of that research, she had collected scat samples from the region. from black bears, mountain lions, bobcats, and other predators, to establish baseline genetic profiles. Among the samples she had collected was one from Quarry Mountain, collected as part of a wildlife survey conducted by the State Wildlife Agency in 2013. The sample came back with an anomaly. The DNA was consistent with canid DNA but contained structural variations that did not match any known domestic dog breed, wolf subspecies, or coyote. The researcher published a brief note in a wildlife genetics journal, suggesting that either the sample had been contaminated, or there was an undocumented canid subspecies present in the Appalachian region. The publication was not widely read, but it was read by Robert Carpenter's daughter, Susan, who kept up with wildlife research and had always been interested in the question of what her father had been trying to study. Susan reached out to the researcher, Dr. Eleanor Hayes. Susan did not tell her the truth. Instead, she suggested that the anomalous sample might be worth investigating further. She suggested that there might be additional samples available if Dr. Hayes was interested in a more thorough survey. Over the course of 6 months, Dr. Hayes worked with Susan to collect new samples from Quarry Mountain. They did this ostensibly as part of a private genetic study, with permission from the families who owned the relevant properties. The families, according to Susan, had been told the truth, that the genetic research had flagged the existence of their creature, and that it was now either time to come clean or to work with a scientist who could help legitimize what they had been hiding. She ran genetic analysis, and in the late spring of 2016 she delivered her findings to the families. The creature was not a mutation of a known species, it was something different. The DNA suggested that it was a canine species that had diverged from known canine lineages approximately 8 to 10,000 years ago. It was genetically distinct enough to potentially be classified as a separate species entirely, though Dr. Hayes was cautious about making such a claim without skeletal or physical material to examine. More importantly, the genetic evidence suggested that the creature was not unique. The genetic profile indicated genetic diversity consistent with a breeding population of somewhere between 15 and 40 individuals, probably distributed across a much wider geographic range than just Quarry Mountain. This is when I became directly involved again. In late 2016, Susan Carpenter contacted me. She said that Dr. Hayes had confirmed the genetic anomaly, and that the families needed to decide what to do with this information. They were divided. Some wanted to go public, some wanted to continue the secret, and some wanted to involve the scientific community without public disclosure. Susan asked if I would be willing to help coordinate with Dr. Hayes to understand what public disclosure would look like, and what the consequences might be. I agreed, but only on the condition that I be allowed to understand the full extent of the program, the current state of the feeding operation, the creature's actual behavior as documented over the past 30 years, and any incidents or encounters that had occurred since my grandfather's death. The families agreed, with strict limitations. I was given access to a secondary ledger that had been maintained by the official caretaker since 1982, a person named Martin Blackwell, who had been hired initially on a part-time basis and had gradually taken on more and more responsibility as the families aged and eventually began to die off. I was not given direct contact with Martin, but I was given access to his documentation, which spanned from 1982 to 2016. That ledger is the one that broke my heart. Martin's entries are meticulous. They are written in a practical, almost engineering-like style. He records feeding schedules, the creature's responses to different food types, its movement patterns, its seasonal behavior, evidence of other creatures, signs of possible offspring, and observations about its intelligence and apparent emotional state. What emerges from reading Martin's documentation is a picture of an animal that is not just surviving but thriving. An animal that understands the arrangement, an animal that has taught this understanding to others like itself. There is an entry from 1989 in Martin's handwriting. Observed 3 creatures at the Northwest feeding site on March 15th. Standard adult male, estimated 1 juvenile male and 1 juvenile female. The juveniles were smaller but showed similar body structure and movement patterns. Feeding was cautious, suggesting the younger individuals were newly integrated to site. Adult male allowed juveniles to feed first. Pattern consistent with family unit behavior observed in social canines. Another entry from 1994. Found tracks indicating at least 2 independent feeding sites being utilized, both within the family's managed territory. Tracks show different weight distribution and gait pattern, suggesting third adult individual previously unobserved. Territory may be larger than previously estimated, or creatures may be ranging more widely than anticipated. And from 2003, the vocalizations have changed. Previously, calls were primarily simple engagement sounds, basic communication related to feeding or territory markers. Current vocalizations show modulation and phrasing that suggests more complex linguistic structure, recorded samples, Recording is included in archive for future analysis. These notes describe an animal or animals that are intelligent, communicative, capable of teaching and learning, social, and above all, aware. Martin notes in a 2008 entry, question, Tokens Namten, at what point does regular feeding of an animal constitute adoption of responsibility for that animal's continued existence? If we stopped feeding today, would it survive? Would it be cruel to stop? We have, through 65 years of maintenance, possibly created a dependency. We have also created a population that may be entirely reliant on our continued participation. It is a question Martin does not answer, because there is no good answer. By 2015, Martin's entries had begun to note something new. Other feeding sites, other people. Evidence suggests the creatures may be receiving supplemental feeding from sources outside the family network. Tracks near the southern property line indicate food scatter that does not match our standard feeding protocol. Appears to be raw meat, possibly from hunting. The presentation suggests purposeful supply, not accidental carrion. This eventually resolved into something Martin documents in March 2016. Direct observation occurred last week during investigation of external feeding site. Individual of unknown affiliation was leaving food at coordinates 35.8843, minus 82.1654. Individual was an older male, approximately 60 years old, Caucasian, wearing camouflage and carrying what appeared to be field notes. He did not observe my presence. I did not confront him. Decision made to monitor but not intervene. If external parties are aware of the creature's existence and are providing care, this represents a significant deviation from protocol. When I read that entry, I realized that the secret had begun to fail. The existence of the creature had leaked. Someone outside the 5 families knew about it. And that person, or those people, were participating in the feeding and care. Have you confronted Martin about this? I asked David Henderson when I showed him this entry. Not directly, David said. But we have been aware for several years that the secret is no longer contained to just the 5 families. There are others on the mountain who know. There are hunters, landowners nearby, people who spend time in these hills. Eventually, anyone who pays attention long enough will notice something is wrong with the predator population. They will notice that there are no attacks. They will notice the patterns. They will begin to draw conclusions. Does Martin have a theory about who the external person is? Martin has never shared that theory with us, but Martin is nearing retirement. Martin has been the anchor of this operation for 35 years, and Martin is becoming uncomfortable with what the operation has become. This is when Susan Carpenter made me an offer. She and David Henderson, along with representatives from the other families, were prepared to make contact with Dr. Eleanor Hayes and to present her with a full disclosure of the situation. They would provide her with all documentation, access to the creature or creatures if possible, and complete transparency about the genetic and behavioral observations that had been accumulating for 60 years. In exchange, they wanted me to help facilitate a plan. The plan was to present the discoveries to the scientific community in a controlled way, through proper academic channels, with proper peer review, and with protections for the family's privacy and the location of Quarry Mountain. The goal was to shift control of the narrative away from the families and toward the scientific establishment, which could provide legitimacy and protection. Why me? I asked. Because you are a genealogist and a researcher, not a sensationalist, David said. Because you are connected to the families by blood, but you have built a life outside the mountain. Because you are the right person to bridge these worlds. I spent 3 weeks considering this offer. I thought about my grandfather. I thought about what he would have wanted. I thought about the creature on Quarry Mountain. Creatures, plural, I now understood, and what they represented. I thought about the possibility that we had discovered a completely unknown species, one that humans had been keeping secret for 60 years. And I thought about what would happen if the truth came out, and what would happen if it did not. I said yes. What followed was the most extraordinary experience of my life. Over the course of 8 months, Dr. Eleanor Hayes conducted the most carefully controlled biological study I have ever been aware of. She worked exclusively with me, with David Henderson, and with Martin Blackwell. No one else in the scientific community was told. No official records were filed. No institutional oversight was involved beyond Dr. Hayes' own laboratory, which operated under private funding. Dr. Hayes collected tissue samples, documented genetic material, conducted behavioral observation from a distance, and even, on 2 separate occasions, observed the creatures directly through telephoto lenses from a vantage point Martin had arranged. Her preliminary conclusion was stunning and, frankly, terrifying in its implications. The creatures on Quarry Mountain were a species that should not exist according to current understanding of Appalachian natural history. They were genetically distinct enough to warrant classification as a new species. They showed signs of intelligence and social complexity far exceeding typical canine behavior. And the genetic diversity suggested a much larger population than the families realized, possibly hundreds distributed across the broader Appalachian region, not just the few dozen that the families had been monitoring. More importantly, the genetic evidence suggested that this species had been present in North America since at least the Pleistocene era. The divergence point in the genetic record suggested that these creatures had split off from the canine lineage before humans had even populated the continent. They were not recent mutations, they were not escapees from some laboratory, they were native. They were an entirely unknown native North American species that had somehow remained hidden from science for thousands of years. Dr. Hayes' working hypothesis was that they were nocturnal, extremely wary of humans, and had likely occupied a very narrow ecological niche that allowed them to remain largely invisible to human observation. The development of more intensive land use, logging, mining, road construction, had compressed their range in the 20th century. And by a remarkable coincidence, the creatures on Quarry Mountain had begun to make contact with humans at precisely the moment when the families were in a position to observe and document that contact. In other words, my grandfather and the other families had not merely discovered a mysterious animal. They had witnessed the moment when an unknown species, pressed by habitat loss and human encroachment, had begun to seek out human settlements and to attempt some form of coexistence with the humans who lived there, and they had responded with compassion instead of violence. They had created a system of mutually beneficial exchange. They had protected not just their own families but an entire species whose existence was completely unknown to science. In late 2016, Dr. Hayes presented her findings to the families. She recommended that the story be published in a major scientific journal, with appropriate methodological transparency and peer review. She explained that the discovery of a new species was extraordinary, but not unprecedented. New species were discovered regularly in remote areas, and there was a well-established protocol for properly documenting and classifying them. The families were divided. Some, particularly the younger members of the families who had grown up after the feeding program had become routine, wanted full disclosure. They wanted the creatures protected under endangered species law. They wanted the scientific community to understand what they had been doing and why. Others, including David Henderson and Thomas Ramsey, were adamantly opposed. They argued that disclosure would lead to public interference, government intervention, and ultimately the death or capture of the creatures. They argued that the secret had protected the creatures for 60 years, and that maintaining the secret was the only way to ensure their survival. The impasse lasted for months. The families could not reach consensus. Dr. Hayes was willing to wait, but she was also clear that her preliminary findings had to eventually be published or risk accusations of scientific misconduct. Then, in March 2017, something happened that forced the decision. A young man named Casey Mitchell, who was hunting illegally on Clayton family property, encountered one of the creatures directly. According to his account, which I eventually read in the police report filed after the incident, he was hunting deer at dusk when a massive dark figure approached him from behind. The creature moved with remarkable speed. Casey fired his rifle in panic. The shot hit the creature in the shoulder, causing a significant wound. The creature did not attack. Instead, it retreated, moving away from Casey with surprising urgency. Casey, terrified and convinced he had just shot something unnatural, fled the property and drove directly to the local sheriff's office. The story he told did not help his case. He claimed to have shot a creature of unknown species. He described it as bipedal, canine-featured, and of extraordinary size. He admitted to hunting illegally, and he implied that the creature was dangerous, though he acknowledged that it had not actually attacked him. The sheriff, John Carmichael, is a practical man who had grown up in the area and had maintained cordial relationships with the families on Quarry Mountain. He listened to Casey's story, took his rifle as evidence, and then followed up by contacting David Henderson. "We need to talk about what is living on your property," Carmichael told Henderson. "A young man just came into my office with a story that sounds like nonsense, but he fired a rifle at something. That makes it my business." David made a decision. He told the truth. Within the space of 2 hours, John Carmichael knew more about the Quarry Mountain creatures than any official representative of state or federal government had ever known. He knew about the 60-year feeding program. He knew about the multiple families' involvement. He knew about Dr. Eleanor Hayes and her genetic research. And he knew that the creature Casey Mitchell had shot was wounded and likely in pain. To his credit, Carmichael did exactly what David Henderson had hoped he would do. He took a breath, asked for the best contact information for Dr. Hayes, and said, "I think I need to speak to someone who knows what we are dealing with before I file any official reports." Dr. Hayes arrived on Quarry Mountain within 6 hours. What followed was extraordinary. Dr. Hayes and Martin Blackwell worked together to locate the wounded creature. With the assistance of the families and a traveling veterinarian named Dr. Sarah Chen, who specializes in exotic animal care, they found the creature in a remote canyon on the northern edge of the family properties. The wound was serious but treatable. The bullet had passed through the shoulder muscle, causing significant hemorrhaging and tissue damage, but had missed major blood vessels and the lung. Dr. Chen was able to clean the wound, administer antibiotics, and provide pain management. The creature, sedated, showed no aggression. It simply lay still while they worked, and when the sedative wore off several hours later, it limped away into the forest. That encounter changed everything. Sheriff Carmichael, faced with the evidence of the creature's existence and the reality of its situation, made a call to the North Carolina Wildlife Resources Commission. He presented them with an abbreviated version of the truth, that there was evidence of an unknown large predator on private property, that it was wounded, and that it represented both a potential public safety concern and a potential biological discovery. The director of the commission, William Torres, is a career biologist. He immediately recognized the implications. He made contact with Dr. Hayes. He reviewed the genetic evidence, and he understood that he was looking at one of the most significant biological discoveries in recent North American history. From that point forward, everything accelerated. By late 2017, the families had made the formal decision to disclose. Dr. Hayes published her preliminary findings in a prestigious journal. The story became public. The creatures on Quarry Mountain became national news. But something remarkable happened. Instead of the chaos and interference the families had feared, the scientific community responded with extraordinary discipline and professionalism. The discovery was treated with the gravity it deserved. Proper protocols were established. Funding was secured. Research teams were assembled with strict guidelines about access and behavior. Within 2 years, the creatures had been formally described and classified as a new species, Canis mysterium, the Appalachian dogman. A research station was established on Quarry Mountain under joint management by North Carolina State University, the U.S. Geological Survey, and the families themselves. The feeding program, which had been secret and informal for 60 years, became official. It became part of a coordinated species management and conservation program. The creatures, it turned out, were endangered. The population across the broader Appalachian region was estimated at no more than 200 individuals, fragmented into small groups, with limited genetic diversity and poor breeding success in the wild. Without active human intervention, precisely the kind of intervention the families had been providing, the species would have been extinct within a generation. The family's decision to manage the creatures, to keep the secret, to protect the animals even at the cost of isolation and uncertainty, had preserved an entire species. I have spent the last 6 years working with Dr. Hayes on historical analysis and documentation of the family's observations. I have also become involved in the formal species management program, applying my genealogical skills to understanding the genetic history of the creatures themselves, a task that has turned out to be surprisingly similar to human genealogy, just with a different set of tools and a much more compressed timeline. The creatures themselves are extraordinary. They are not mythological. They are not supernatural. They are simply a species that humans had not yet discovered, one that possesses a level of intelligence and social complexity that has required us to completely revise our understanding of canine cognition. They communicate through vocalizations that are far more complex than typical canine communication. They show clear evidence of teaching and learning across generations. They have family structures that are remarkably similar to human kinship patterns. They are also dangerous. Several incidents have occurred since the research program began, though none have been fatal. The creatures are apex predators with sharp teeth and powerful muscles. They can and will attack if they feel threatened or if they perceive humans as competitors for resources. But they can also be taught. They can be managed. They respond to consistency and routine, and they demonstrate what can only be described as cooperation with humans who approach them with respect. The story became for a brief period a cause célèbre in conservation and ecological circles. There were media appearances, documentaries, books being discussed, universities teaching the case as an example of community-based conservation. The families eventually became something of celebrities, the guardians who had secretly preserved a species. But here is the thing about secrets that become public. They stop being secrets, but they also stop being private. Within 2 years of the disclosure, there were protesters on the mountain, environmental groups demanding stronger protections, hunters demanding access, academics demanding research privileges, media crews demanding interviews. My mother in particular grew tired of the attention. She eventually sold the Quarry Mountain property and moved away. The Hendersons did the same. The Carpenters, the Ramseys, and the Claytons maintained their properties, but they retreated into privacy, refusing interviews and limiting their involvement in the research program. The creatures themselves, Canis Mysterium, have become something different than they were. They are no longer animals living on a private mountain. They are a managed population, studied constantly, their every behavior documented, their genetics analyzed, their movements tracked with radio collars and GPS units. I wonder sometimes if that is better or worse than The Secret. David Henderson once said to me, about a year after the disclosure, we kept them safe by keeping them unknown. Now that the world knows about them, we keep them safe through bureaucracy and conservation law and academic protocols. But something has been lost. They are no longer free. They are preserved, yes. They are protected, yes. But they are not free in any meaningful sense. I did not argue with him, because I think he is right. The wounded creature from the Casey Mitchell incident survived. Dr. Hayes kept track of it for years afterward. It recovered fully from its wound. It went on to breed. We documented 2 offspring. It became in a sense the individual through which the entire species transitioned from secret to public. That creature died in 2022, probably from natural causes, though we found the body decomposed and could not determine the precise cause. It was 7 years old, which is old for a wild Canis Mysterium but not elderly. Possibly disease, possibly an accident, possibly something else entirely. When Dr. Hayes told me about its death, I found myself unexpectedly emotional. I had spent years studying the creature through observation and documentation. I had never met it directly, though I had reviewed hundreds of photographs and hours of video. And yet its death felt like losing something irreplaceable. I think that is the real cost of secrets, once they become public. The families had carried the burden of secrecy for 40 years because they understood that knowledge is a burden. They had chosen to bear that burden themselves rather than distribute it to the world. And for 40 years they had lived with that weight, the weight of knowing something impossible, of protecting something extraordinary, of living every day with the knowledge that if the secret ever broke, everything would change. When the secret finally did break, everything did change. But not in the way they had feared. The change was not catastrophic. It was subtle, long-term, and very human. The world lost the ability to contain its wonder. The creatures lost the ability to be completely unknown. The families lost their role as protectors and became instead the people who had kept the truth hidden. Some people, conservationists, scientists, ecologists, saw them as heroes. Others, transparency advocates, government watchdogs, saw them as people who had withheld crucial information from the public and nearly allowed an entire species to go extinct through secrecy. They became complicated. They became controversial. They became, in short, human. My grandfather never had to face that complication. He maintained his secret and took it to his grave. The second generation, my mother, David Henderson, Robert Carpenter, lived most of their lives in privacy, only near the end watching their world become public. I am part of the third generation, the one that had to navigate both the secret and its disclosure, and I think about often what the fourth generation, the youngest members of the families who grew up during the transition, will make of all this. I think about the children who were told, perhaps for the first time at age 8 or 9 or 10, that their family had been keeping a secret about unknown animals living on their mountain. I think about what that does to a child's understanding of truth and family and responsibility. I think about whether they will see their family's silence as noble or deceptive. I think about the creatures themselves, now named and categorized and documented. I think about whether they are better off known or unknown. I think about whether our protection serves them or imprisons them. These are the questions that the 40-year silence bought the families time to avoid. And now that the silence is broken, they are questions every single one of us has to reckon with. The research program continues. The creatures are thriving by the measure we use. The population is stable. Breeding is occurring. The genetic diversity is limited but not critically so. The species, by all available evidence, will not go extinct. But I wonder, and I think this is the question my grandfather was asking in that final entry in his ledger, at what point does managing an animal become a form of captivity? At what point does protection become control? At what point do we stop saving a species and start owning it? These are not questions with good answers. They are the price of being the only people who knew, for 40 years, what was true. The official report says a large gray wolf trapped my brother and me in a hunting cabin in southwestern Montana. It says the animal circled the building during a snowstorm, damaged our truck, and entered through a window after being wounded. That report leaves out the bare human footprints mixed with the wolf tracks. It says nothing about the brass key we heard turning in the locked door. It also leaves out what stood beneath the porch light at 4:17 in the morning, upright, with a man's wedding ring buried in the fur of its left hand. This is a fictionalized account inspired by wilderness folklore. If it makes you check the tree line twice, leave a like, subscribe, and share it with somebody who thinks a locked cabin would be enough to keep them safe. My name is Caleb Rourke. I was 43 when this happened, and by then I had been hunting the mountains of Montana for a little over 30 years. I am not a guide, wildlife biologist, or professional tracker. My actual job is land surveying. I spend most of my working life locating boundaries, measuring grades, and walking places that developers, utility companies, and county engineers need mapped before they send machinery in. That work teaches you to notice details, the angle of a cut bank, the way old tire impressions hold water, whether a fallen branch came down naturally or was moved, how long snow has been exposed based on the crust, the crystals around the edge, and the amount of debris settled into it. You learn to tell the difference between a place that feels empty and a place that has recently been disturbed. My younger brother Mason was better with engines than I was. He had worked as a diesel mechanic in Billings since his early 20s. He could hear an injector problem before I could identify which vehicle had started. He was also a more instinctive hunter. I planned routes, studied maps, and worried about wind direction. Mason could look at a hillside for 10 seconds and tell you which strip of timber an elk would choose when the weather turned. We made a good team when we were younger. By the autumn of 2008, we had barely spoken in 11 months. Our father, Frank Rourke, had died the previous January after a short illness. He had owned a one-room hunting cabin on a private inholding near the eastern edge of the Gravelly Range. The building sat in a narrow drainage we called Burnt Fork, though I never saw that name on an official map. It was 12 miles from the nearest maintained road and almost 6 miles beyond the point where the county stopped plowing. Dad built the cabin in 1982 with 2 friends from the railroad. It was not much to look at. 20 feet long, 14 feet wide, peeled log walls, a shallow sleeping loft, and a porch that leaned slightly downhill because one of the support posts had settled. There was no electricity. Water came from a hand pump connected to a shallow well beneath the floor. Heat came from a black iron stove near the east wall. To Mason and me, it had been the most important building in the world. Dad took us there every November. We learned to split wood on the chopping block beside the porch. We learned not to leave food in our packs, not to chamber around while climbing over deadfall, and not to mistake confidence for judgment. After Dad died, the cabin came to us equally. Mason wanted to sell it. I did not. The cabin was only part of the reason we had stopped speaking, but it was easier to discuss than the things that actually hurt. The final weekend of Montana's general elk season was supposed to be our compromise. We would drive in, hunt for 2 days, inventory Dad's belongings, and decide what to keep. After that, we would meet with a realtor who specialized in recreational property. That was what I told Mason, though I had no intention of selling. We left Bozeman before sunrise on Friday, November 21st. Mason arrived at my house in Dad's old truck, a dark green 1997 Ford F-250 with a steel bumper and enough dents to tell the history of every ranch gate Dad had ever misjudged. Mason stepped out wearing a canvas coat, a faded orange cap, and the same expression he had worn at the funeral. "You packed chains?" he asked. "2 sets. Tow strap, behind the seat, extra coolant." I held up a plastic jug. He nodded once as if I had passed an inspection, and began loading his rifle case. We brought food for 4 days even though we intended to stay for 2. Dad had taught us that rule after a storm trapped him and a friend in Burnt Fork for nearly a week in 1986. We packed canned stew, oatmeal, coffee, jerky, 2 gallons of drinking water, a first aid kit, spare wool clothes, lantern fuel, road flares, and enough ammunition for a trip that should have required no more than 3 shots. Mason carried a bolt-action .300 Winchester Magnum. I used Dad's old .3006, a walnut-stocked rifle with worn checkering where his palm had held it for decades. The forecast called for light snow Friday night, heavier accumulation late Saturday, and clearing by Sunday afternoon. Nothing unusual for November. The temperature was expected to fall below 10 degrees after dark, but the cabin had enough dry lodge poles stacked along the south wall to last a week. We reached the town of Ennis shortly after 8, ate breakfast at a cafe, and stopped for fuel. The woman behind the counter recognized Dad's truck. Her name was Ruth Crowell. She owned a small cattle operation west of the National Forest boundary and had known our family since before Mason was born. She was in her late 60s, thin, sharp-eyed, and still wore her gray hair in a long braid down her back. "I heard Frank's boys were coming in," she said. "Word travels fast," Mason replied. "Your truck travels slow." She looked through the window toward the fuel pumps. "Road might be rough past Crowell Creek. One of my hands checked fence up there Wednesday. Said the north-facing sections were iced over." "We brought chains," I said. Ruth did not respond immediately. She rang up our fuel, then leaned both hands against the counter. "You boys carrying a radio?" "2 handhelds," I said, "and the CB in the truck. Keep them on Channel 7 after dark." Mason gave me a quick look. Something going on, he asked. Ruth looked toward a man standing near the coffee machine. He was wearing a county road department jacket and reading a newspaper. When she spoke again, her voice was lower. A hunter didn't come out Tuesday. Lost, I asked. Maybe. She said his name was Emmett Voss. He was 54, lived outside Dillon, and had drawn a late-season cow elk permit for a district south of Burnt Fork. His pickup had been found at a trailhead with the driver's door unlocked. His pack, sleeping bag, and spare coat were still inside. Search and rescue had covered the main drainages on Wednesday and Thursday but found no sign of him. What was he doing that far north? Mason asked. Nobody knows that he was. Ruth slid our receipt across the counter. His truck was south. Doesn't mean he stayed there. Any tracks? I asked. A lot of tracks. The way she said it made me wait. What kind? Searchers said wolf, bigger than they liked. Wolves were not uncommon in that part of Montana. They created arguments in every cafe, feed store, and county meeting from Dillon to Livingston, but they were not monsters. Most avoided people. A lone wolf following an elk hunter might be inconvenient or unnerving, but it was not evidence of anything unnatural. Wolves don't usually hide hunters' bodies, Mason said. Ruth's mouth tightened. They don't usually open gates either. The road department worker turned a page of his newspaper. Ruth picked up a rag and began wiping a clean section of counter. What gate? I asked. Probably nothing. Just something Dean mentioned. Dean who? My hand. Found the upper pasture gate open 2 mornings in a row. Chain lifted off the post and laid on the ground. No tire tracks. Could have been another hunter, I said. Could have. She did not sound convinced. Before we left, she touched my sleeve. If you hear anybody on Channel 7, make sure they identify themselves before you tell them where you are. Mason laughed softly. Ruth, are you worried about poachers or ghosts? I'm worried about men who joke when somebody is missing. That ended the conversation. For the first hour after Ennis, Mason and I discussed road conditions, fuel mileage, and whether the storm would push elk lower. We did not mention Dad, the cabin, or the sale. The paved road narrowed to gravel, then the gravel narrowed to twin muddy tracks between sagebrush. Snow appeared in the shadows beneath the Douglas firs. By noon we had put chains on all 4 tires. The last ranch lay 8 miles behind us when we reached the National Forest boundary. An old wooden sign marked the entrance to a system of logging spurs built in the 1960s. Most had not been maintained in years. Some ended at collapsed culverts. Others faded into young timber. Dad's cabin was reached by following Forest Road 417 west for 4 miles, taking an unmarked left at a burned snag, then descending along a ridge until the road crossed Burnt Fork Creek. The creek crossing was normally shallow enough for a truck. That afternoon, shelf ice had formed along both banks, leaving a channel of black water between them. Mason got out and walked across before we attempted it. He broke the edge ice with an axe, checked the bottom with a pole, and guided me through from the far side. The water came halfway up the tires. You remember when Dad tried this in the Dodge? Mason asked after climbing back into the cab. He made it. He flooded the distributor. He still made it. He spent 3 hours drying it beside a fire. But he made it. Mason almost smiled. It was the closest we came to discussing a good memory. The first track appeared half a mile beyond the creek. I saw it where the road curved around a stand of subalpine fir. Something had stepped from the timber, crossed the left tire rut, and continued along the road. I stopped the truck. Mason leaned forward. Problem? Track. He looked through the windshield. Wolf? Maybe. We got out. The print measured almost 6 inches from the rear pad to the tip of the longest toe. The snow was soft enough to exaggerate size, especially where the animal had punched through a thin crust, but it was still large. The toes were symmetrical. Claw marks showed at the front. The rear pad had the broad triangular shape of a canid rather than the lobed pad of a cat. Mason crouched beside it. Big male, strides short, walking slow. I followed the trail with my eyes. The animal had moved directly down the middle of the road. Wolves often conserve energy by using roads, trails, frozen rivers, or packed snow. Nothing about that was unusual. What bothered me was the depth. The print in the tire rut had broken through nearly 3 inches of crust. My boot left a mark less than half as deep. Heavier than it looks, I said. Or that spot was softer. Mason stood and brushed snow from his knee. Don't turn it into a story. I had not realized I was doing that until he said it. We drove another quarter mile before the tracks turned off the road. At the edge of the timber, the animal had paused. 4 prints were grouped close together, facing back toward us. Then the tracks disappeared beneath the trees. We reached the cabin at 2:20 in the afternoon. The clearing looked smaller than I remembered. Young lodgepole had grown around its edges, narrowing the open space between the building and the forest. Snow covered the roof. The stovepipe leaned slightly west. The porch sagged more than it had the previous year. Dad had installed heavy wooden shutters after a black bear broke a window in 1994. Each shutter closed from the inside and locked with a steel pin. The front door had 2 locks, a standard deadbolt and a thick oak crossbar that dropped into iron brackets bolted through the logs. There was also a trapdoor beneath the table that led into a shallow root cellar. The cellar was only 4 feet high and held canned food, lantern fuel, tools, and a hand-operated winch used to raise game animals on the meat pole outside. A narrow wood chute connected the cellar to a hatch beneath the porch. Dad used it to slide split firewood inside during storms. All I cared about then was getting the stove lit before the temperature fell. Mason unlocked the front door. Cold air rolled out carrying the smell of dry wood, dust, and old ashes. Everything appeared as we had left it after Dad's final season. His red wool coat hung on a peg. Tin cups sat upside down beside the sink. A calendar from 2007 remained open to November. Mason set his rifle case on the table. "You want the left bunk. Doesn't matter. You always took the left. We're not 12. No. We're definitely not." He climbed into the loft without waiting for an answer. I opened the stove and found a small stack of kindling already arranged inside. Dad used to prepare the next fire before leaving. It had been sitting there for more than a year. I struck a match. As the paper caught, I noticed a gray smear on the stove door. It looked like ash at first. When I rubbed it with my thumb, the mark came away greasy and dark. There were 3 parallel lines, each about 4 inches long. Hair clung to one of them. The strand was coarse, black at the base, and silver toward the tip. "Something get in here," I called. Mason came down from the loft. I showed him the hair. He examined the room. The shutters were closed. The door had been locked. The chimney opening was too narrow for anything larger than a squirrel. "Probably from Dad's coat," he said. "Dad didn't own anything with fur like this." Then it came off a glove. He dropped the strand into the stove. It curled in the flame and produced a sharp, unpleasant smell. Problem solved. I did not argue. We unloaded the truck, filled the water tank, and checked the cabin for damage. The north window frame had deep scratches in it, but they were outside rather than inside. A bear might have stood against the wall and investigated the shutter. A porcupine might have chewed the wood. The marks were old enough that their edges had darkened. Mason inspected the truck while I split kindling. "Coolant's good," he said. "Battery connections are clean. We leave Sunday morning, not Sunday afternoon. Depends on the weather. No, it depends on us not getting sentimental and wasting half the day." I set the axe down. "You want to talk about the cabin, talk about it. I thought that was why we came. We came to hunt. We came because you wouldn't answer the lawyer." I answered him. "You told him you needed time." "I did. You've had 10 months. Mason opened the driver's door and reached behind the seat. "You have a house. I have a mortgage and 2 kids. I can't keep paying taxes and repairs on a building we use 4 days a year. I'll buy your half." "With what?" I did not have an answer ready. Mason removed a cardboard box from the truck. Inside were Dad's papers, photographs, and a few personal items from the nursing facility. Mason had kept them because I left early after Dad died. He placed the box on the cabin table. "We inventory everything tonight. Tomorrow we hunt. Sunday we leave. You make every conversation sound like a work order. And you make every decision by refusing to make one." He climbed into the loft again. The fire cracked in the stove. Outside something moved along the tree line. I saw a gray shape pass between 2 trunks, low and fast. By the time I reached the window it was gone. We spent the remaining daylight checking the area around the cabin. The meat pole stood 20 yards east of the porch. It consisted of 2 upright logs connected by a crossbeam about 10 feet above the ground. A steel cable ran through a pulley and into the root cellar, where the hand winch could lift an elk quarter beyond the reach of most scavengers. The cable had rusted but remained strong. Behind the cabin, Dad had stacked nearly 2 cords of split lodgepole beneath a corrugated metal roof. Some of the wood had shifted downhill, but most was dry. Mason found tracks near the north wall. The same large canid had circled the cabin before our arrival. Its prints were partly filled by wind-blown snow, making them difficult to age. They passed beneath both windows, crossed the porch, and stopped at the front door. The snow directly in front of the threshold had been disturbed. Mason knelt. "It sat here. How can you tell? Front paws side by side, rear end here." He pointed to a broad depression in the snow. The animal had sat facing the door, not for a moment either. The hollow was deep and smooth, as if body heat had melted the snow before it refroze. "Maybe it smelled mice," Mason said. "Through a log wall? Food then." There wasn't food inside. He looked at me. You want it to be strange? No, I don't. Then stop arguing with normal explanations. He followed the tracks off the porch. At the south corner of the cabin, the prints became confused where snow had fallen from the roof. Beyond that point we could not find them. We ate canned stew and went through Dad's belongings. Most of the box contained ordinary things: property tax receipts, appliance manuals, hunting licenses, letters from insurance companies, photographs of Mason and me holding fish, standing beside elk, or pretending not to be cold. At the bottom we found Dad's wedding ring. He had removed it when his hands began swelling during treatment. Mason picked it up, turned it between his fingers and placed it on the table. You should take that, he said. Why me? You're the oldest. That doesn't mean anything. It meant something to him. I stared at the ring. Dad and I had argued during the last week of his life. He wanted to leave the care facility and return home. The doctors said he would not survive the trip comfortably. I told him we could not manage his medication there. He accused me of making decisions because they were easier for me. Mason had been working in North Dakota that week. Dad asked me to call him. I told Dad that Mason's phone went straight to voicemail. That was a lie. I had not called. Dad died the following morning. Mason did not know. He believed he had missed the last call because he was asleep after a 16-hour shift. I had allowed him to believe that for almost a year. I reached for the ring. A knock sounded against the north wall. Not loud. 3 taps, evenly spaced. Mason froze with his hand still above the table. We both listened. The sound did not repeat. A branch? He asked. No branches reached that wall. We took our rifles and stepped onto the porch. Darkness had settled over the clearing. The temperature had dropped quickly. Our breath hung in the lantern light. I swept a flashlight across the north side of the cabin. Nothing moved. Snow stretched unbroken between the wall and the timber, except for the old tracks we had already examined. Mason walked around the corner. Could have been ice sliding. From where? The roof. Sideways? He shone his light along the logs. Near the center of the north wall, 3 wet marks darkened the wood. They were shoulder high. Mason touched one with a gloved finger. Snowball. Thrown by who? He aimed his light toward the trees. Somebody messing with us. In this weather? Hunters do stupid things. I called into the darkness. No one answered. We circled the clearing but found no fresh boot prints. The wolf tracks near the cabin were older and partly crusted. No trail led close enough for someone to throw anything without crossing open snow. Mason returned to the porch. Inside. We dropped the crossbar into its brackets and closed the shutters. That night, I woke several times. The first time the stove had burned low. The second time I heard claws moving across the porch. I held my breath and listened. The steps were slow. 4 distinct contacts followed by a faint scrape, then 4 more. The animal crossed from left to right, paused outside the door, and continued around the corner. I reached toward the loft floor and tapped twice. Mason's sleeping bag rustled. You hear it? I whispered. Yeah. Wolf? Sounds like it. We waited. The footsteps made one complete circuit of the cabin, then another. On the 3rd circuit they stopped beneath the north window. Something rubbed against the shutter. The wood creaked inward. Mason climbed down carrying his rifle. The shutter was locked with a steel pin. He placed his hand against it. Pressure came from the other side. The pressure was steady rather than an impact or scratching. The center board bowed slightly. Mason backed away and raised his rifle. The pressure stopped. A wet breath passed through the narrow gaps around the frame. The smell reached us a second later. Animal musk, damp fur, and something sour beneath it. I picked up the iron stove poker. What are you going to do with that? Mason asked. I don't know. The animal moved away. We heard it cross the porch again. Then silence. Neither of us slept afterward. At dawn the temperature was 9 degrees. The sky was clear enough that we decided to hunt before the storm arrived. Staying near the cabin because of one curious wolf seemed foolish. We had rifles, experience, and several miles of open country around us. Outside, fresh tracks completely encircled the building. The animal had walked the same route repeatedly until the snow was packed into a shallow trench. At the north window, the prints came within inches of the wall. At the front door, the animal had sat again. Mason crouched and examined the tracks. Same wolf. You think it's normal now? I think it's habituated. To what? People, cabins, hunters leaving scraps. We never fed wolves here. Other people exist, Caleb. He followed the trail toward the meat pole. The animal had walked beneath it, stood on its hind legs and placed both front paws against one upright log. The marks reached nearly 7 feet above the ground. A large wolf can stand surprisingly tall, especially when stretching. I knew that. The prints on the wood were not paw prints. They were long smears ending in 5 narrow grooves. Mason stared at them. Bear, he said, with wolf tracks. Tracks overlap. Where are the bear prints? He searched the snow. There were none. The trail leaving the pole was clean. 4 canid prints, evenly spaced, leading directly into the timber. Mason walked to the truck. We're hunting. His voice made it clear that the discussion was over. We followed an old logging spur west from the cabin, gaining elevation toward a series of open benches where elk often fed before bedding in thick timber. 6 inches of snow covered the ground. More had drifted against fallen logs. The morning was quiet, but not unnaturally so. Chickadees moved through the branches. A raven called from the ridge. We saw fresh mule deer tracks, coyote scat, and the winding trail of a snowshoe hare. For the first 2 hours, nothing happened. 2 uneventful hours eased my nerves. By 9:30, I had convinced myself that the marks on the meat pole were caused by a bear during warmer weather and the wolf had crossed them later. I even began to feel embarrassed by how quickly I had allowed Ruth's warning to affect me. We reached a saddle above Burnt Fork and found elk sign. Several cows had crossed the slope before daylight. Their tracks led toward a north-facing basin protected from the wind. The trail was fresh enough that loose snow still clung to the sides of the prints. Mason tested the breeze. They're close. We moved slowly. The basin narrowed between 2 ridges. Timber covered the upper slopes, while sagebrush and knee-high grass filled the bottom. We found beds beneath a group of fir trees, still warm enough to have softened the snow. The elk had left suddenly. Branches were broken. Snow had been kicked backward. 1 cow had slipped and cut a groove nearly 6 feet long before regaining her footing. They wind us? I whispered. Mason shook his head. The air moved from the basin toward us. Something else had pushed the herd out. We followed the tracks until they separated. Most climbed toward the western ridge. 1 set, belonging to a large animal, continued down the drainage. 20 yards farther, we found blood. Several dark drops marked the snow. The injured animal had staggered once, leaving a deep impression where its front knees struck the ground. No rifle shot, Mason said. We would have heard it. Could be an arrow. We followed. The blood trail ended beside a fallen spruce. The elk was not there. Instead, a drag mark crossed the snow toward the trees. An adult cow elk can weigh 500 pounds. A wolf pack can move 1, especially downhill, but there were no multiple tracks around the drag, only 1 set. The same oversized wolf prints. Mason studied the scene. It attacked her here. 1 wolf. Maybe the others stayed off the soft snow. They would leave something. He did not answer. The drag trail entered dense timber. We followed for another 30 yards before the ground dropped sharply into a narrow ravine. The elk lay at the bottom. Its neck was twisted beneath it. Snow covered part of the body, as though it had rolled during the fall. I could see no feeding damage from where we stood. The wolf tracks ended at the top of the slope. Beside them were 2 bare human footprints. The first print was deep, heel clearly defined, toes pointing toward the ravine. The second was farther downhill, partly obscured where snow had collapsed beneath it. No boot prints approached or left. Mason lowered his rifle. Somebody stepped into the wolf tracks. Barefoot. Could be a damaged boot. You can see the toes. He moved closer. The larger print had 5 toes, but the second toe was shortened. Not missing exactly. It appeared to end halfway down. There's somebody down there, Mason said. He called into the ravine. No response. We descended carefully. At the bottom we found the elk. Its throat and shoulder were damaged, though not in the way I expected from a wolf attack. There were punctures, but the spacing was wider than any wolf jaw I had seen. A straight cut marked the hide near the shoulder, too clean to be a tear. Mason ran 1 finger above the wound without touching it. Knife. Looks like it. So there's a hunter. Without boots. Maybe he lost one. Maybe he's hurt. We searched the ravine for almost an hour. We found no person, clothing, weapon, or further tracks. The snow beneath the trees was patchy, but the ground between exposed areas should have shown something. At 10:50, Mason climbed back toward the saddle. We need to report it. With what? The radio from the cabin. Ruth said Channel 7. You think this is Voss? I think a missing hunter and a barefoot print in the same area deserve a phone call. We abandoned our hunt and headed back. Halfway to the cabin, I noticed movement behind us. A large gray wolf stood on the ridge we had just crossed. It was nearly 200 yards away. The animal's coat was dark along the shoulders and silver around the neck. Its chest appeared unusually deep. Even at that distance I could tell it was larger than any wolf I had seen in the wild. It watched us. Mason raised his binoculars. Same animal. How do you know? Left hind leg. The wolf favored it slightly. Through my scope I saw the animal turn sideways. Its belly looked narrow, almost starved, but the shoulders were heavy. A dark stain marked the fur along its muzzle. It took 3 steps toward us. "Hey!" Mason shouted. The wolf stopped. Wild wolves generally avoid direct confrontation with people. Even habituated animals tend to circle, retreat or maintain distance. This one did none of those things. It lowered its head. Then it walked toward us again. Mason fired into the snow several yards in front of it. The shot cracked through the basin. The wolf flinched but did not run. It stared at the mark where the bullet struck. Then it looked back at Mason. That reaction bothered me more than aggression would have. It appeared to understand exactly what the warning shot meant. Mason chambered another round. The wolf turned and disappeared below the ridge. We reached the cabin shortly after noon. Clouds had moved over the range. Fine snow began falling almost immediately. We tried the handheld radios on Channel 7 but received only static. The CB in the truck had greater range, especially from high ground, but Burnt Fork was surrounded by ridges. We heard fragments of conversation from somewhere south, too broken to understand. Mason repeated a call for Ruth Crowell or search and rescue. No one answered. We ate, packed extra clothing, and decided to climb a ridge behind the cabin where the radio might connect. Before leaving, Mason checked the truck. "Caleb." His tone brought me around the hood. The latch was open. We had both seen him close it the previous afternoon. Mason lifted the hood. The negative battery cable had been removed from the terminal. Nothing had been torn or chewed. The nut had been loosened and placed on top of the battery. A small crescent wrench lay on the air cleaner. It came from Dad's toolbox beneath the rear seat. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. "You leave the truck unlocked?" I asked. "No." "Where were the keys?" "In my coat." "Maybe Dad's spare." "Dad's spare is taped under the porch rail." I looked toward the cabin. The spare key was an old habit. Dad hid one beneath the right side of the porch in a plastic film canister. Anyone who had visited him more than once might have known. Mason closed the hood slowly. "Check it." I knelt beside the porch. The film canister was gone. A clean rectangle showed where the tape had been attached. We searched the snow around the truck. Large wolf tracks approached from the timber. They passed along the driver's side, circled the front bumper, and stopped beside the hood. On the opposite side of the truck were human footprints, bare feet again. The right print was complete. The left showed the same shortened second toe. The human tracks led 3 steps away from the truck. Then wolf prints continued in their place. There was no overlap, no second trail, no sign that someone had put on boots or that an animal had crossed later. One set ended, the other began. Mason walked backward until his shoulders touched the cabin wall. "That's impossible." I wish I could say I remained calm because of experience or maturity. I did not. I began searching faster, moving around the truck, looking for the detail that would fix what I was seeing. A hidden boot print, a second trackway, a place where snow had fallen from a branch and erased the transition. Nothing fixed it. The tracks showed a 4-legged animal approaching the truck, standing near the hood, and leaving upright on 2 bare feet. 20 yards later, the human trail changed back. Mason raised his rifle toward the trees. "Who's out there?" Snow fell through the branches. No answer came. We reconnected the battery and started the engine. Mason wanted to leave immediately. I agreed. Whatever was happening, the storm made staying dangerous. We could report the tracks and missing hunter from town. We could return with law enforcement or wildlife officers. We loaded our equipment in less than 10 minutes. The truck rolled 30 yards before the steering pulled left. Mason stopped. The front tire was flat. A 2-inch cut ran through the sidewall. The rubber had not been punctured by a nail or sharp rock. 4 parallel marks crossed the tire, close enough together to resemble claws. We replaced it with the spare. While Mason worked, I stood guard. The forest remained still. Snow thickened, softening the edges of the clearing. Visibility dropped to less than 100 yards. At one point I thought I saw a person standing between the trees west of the cabin. The shape was tall, narrow and dark. I aimed my rifle. It moved sideways behind a trunk. "What?" Mason asked. "Somebody in the timber." He grabbed his rifle. We watched for almost a minute. A gray animal stepped out 50 yards uphill, the wolf. It stood partly concealed behind a fir tree. Its head appeared on one side of the trunk, while its body remained hidden. Mason shouted. The wolf withdrew. A moment later, a branch snapped near the opposite edge of the clearing. It had moved more than 100 yards in a few seconds, or a second animal was present. "Finish the tire," I said. "I'm going as fast as I can." When the spare was mounted, we climbed into the truck. I drove. The road from the cabin climbed sharply for half a mile before leveling along the ridge. Snow accumulated faster than the chains could clear it. The truck slid twice, but we continued. We reached the burned snag marking the junction with Road 417. A lodgepole pine lay across the road. The trunk was nearly 18 inches thick. Fresh wood showed at the base. It had not blown down. The tree had been pushed or cut. Mason got out with the chainsaw. I kept the engine running and watched the timber. The saw started on the third pull. Mason cut through the upper branches, clearing enough space to reach the trunk. Snow swirled in the headlights. A low cough came from behind the truck, human enough to stop me cold. I turned in the seat. Nothing stood in the road. I opened the door and shouted for Mason. The wolf struck the passenger side of the truck hard enough to rock it on its suspension. Its head appeared above the hood. For one instant, the animal's face was less than 6 feet from mine. The skull was too broad through the cheeks. The ears were flattened. Its mouth hung partly open, showing teeth longer than a wolf's should have been. The eyes were pale brown, almost the color of old whiskey. It looked at me as though it recognized me. Then it hooked its front limbs over the metal and hauled itself onto the hood. Its front limbs bent at angles that resembled arms. Long toes spread against the metal, claws scraping paint. I fired through the windshield. The glass burst outward. The animal fell from the hood. Mason ran toward the truck. The wolf rose almost immediately. Blood darkened the fur high on its right shoulder. Mason fired. His bullet struck behind the ribs. The wolf rolled into the snow, kicked once, and disappeared over the downhill side of the road. "Get in!" I shouted. Mason opened the passenger door. Behind him, something rose from the ditch. At first I thought the wolf had leaped. Then I realized it was standing. Its hind legs straightened beneath it. The spine lifted. The front limbs hung at its sides, longer than a man's arms, and still covered in dark fur. It stood nearly 7 feet tall. Mason saw my expression and turned. The thing crossed the road in 2 strides. Mason fired from the hip. The shot struck its chest. It hit him before he could chamber another round. Mason flew backward against the truck door. The creature's hand swept across his coat, tearing fabric from shoulder to elbow. I fired again. The thing dropped to all fours and ran into the timber without a limp, though 3 bullets had hit it. Mason climbed into the cab, holding his left arm. "Drive. The tree. Back up." I reversed along the narrow ridge road. The truck fishtailed, struck a snowbank, and nearly slid downhill. I kept moving until we reached a wide place where an old spur had been cut into the slope. We turned around and returned to the cabin. Neither of us discussed another option. Mason's injury looked worse than it was. The claws had torn through his coat and cut 3 lines across his upper arm, but the wounds were shallow. The impact against the door bruised his ribs and shoulder. I cleaned the cuts with antiseptic and bandaged them. "Did it bite you?" I asked. "No." "You sure? I know the difference between teeth and claws." He sat near the stove while I patched the damaged section of his coat with duct tape. Outside, snow erased our tire tracks. "What did you see?" Mason asked. "You saw it. Say it." "I don't know what it was." "That's not what I asked." I looked toward the shuttered windows. It stood up. Animals stand up. Not like that. No. He touched the bandage on his arm. "No, they don't." We checked the rifles. I had fired 3 rounds. Mason had fired 2, including the shot into the creature's chest. We had more ammunition, but the shots had not stopped it. "We hit it," Mason said. "I saw blood. Then it can bleed. That doesn't mean it can be killed. Everything can be killed." Dad used to say that when we were children, usually while discussing mechanical problems, dangerous animals, or trees he intended to cut down. Mason heard the same memory in the words. He stared at the fire. "We should have sold this place in March." I did not answer. The storm continued through the afternoon. We could no longer see the tree line from the cabin windows. Snow struck the logs in waves. Wind moved over the roof with a low continuous roar. We strengthened the shutters with sections of shelving, moved the table against the door, and placed lanterns where they would not blind us if we needed to shoot. The front door remained our greatest concern. The deadbolt was ordinary. The oak bar was stronger, but the iron brackets were attached to logs softened by age. Repeated impacts could tear them out. Mason found a length of steel chain in the root cellar and looped it through the door handle, securing it to a bolt in the floor. While he worked, I noticed a small black box mounted to the meat pole cable spool. Dad had installed a trail camera the year before he got sick. I had forgotten about it. The camera itself was outside, attached to a tree facing the clearing. A wire ran underground to the root cellar so Dad could retrieve images without climbing through deep snow. The equipment was primitive by current standards, but it stored photographs on a removable memory card. I pulled the card. Mason brought down an old laptop from the loft. Dad used it for maps and hunting records. The battery was dead, so Mason connected it to a small inverter powered by a marine battery in the cellar. The computer took several minutes to start. The camera folder contained more than 400 photographs. Most were from the previous winter. Mule deer crossed the clearing. A black bear investigated the porch in April. Coyotes moved past the meat pole. Snow melted, grass grew, and shadows shifted. Then the dates jumped to that week. The camera had activated Tuesday night at 2:14. A large gray wolf stood at the edge of the clearing. In the next photograph it was closer. The third showed it beside the meat pole. The fourth image was blurred, as if the animal had moved rapidly toward the camera. The fifth showed nothing. At 3:41 in the morning, the camera activated again. A naked man walked across the clearing. His back faced the lens. He was tall and thin, with dark hair reaching his shoulders. Blood streaked one side of his body. He carried something over his right shoulder. I enlarged the image. It appeared to be a section of elk hide. The next frame showed the man closer to the cabin. His left foot was raised. The second toe ended halfway down. Mason leaned nearer to the screen. Emmett Voss. You don't know that. He's missing. We find his truck. We find his tracks. Who else? We don't know what he looks like. Call Ruth. With what? Mason sat back. The next photograph had been taken 1 minute later. The man was gone. A wolf stood where he had been. Its head turned toward the camera. The timestamps showed no gap large enough for one subject to leave and another to enter. The position of the hind feet matched the man's footprints in the previous image. We examined the photographs repeatedly. Each time I hoped to find evidence of manipulation, damage, double exposure, or a second person. The images remained the same. We're not dealing with a wolf, Mason said. No. Say what it is. I closed the computer. Giving it a name doesn't help. It helps me know what kind of ammunition we need. We have ammunition. It didn't work. It hurt it. So what does work? I did not say silver. The word came to mind because of every film, book, and campfire story we had heard as children. Saying it aloud would have made the situation feel ridiculous. We had not crossed into a world where old legends automatically became instruction manuals. We had seen an animal stand upright and a series of impossible photographs. That did not mean every superstition was accurate. We use what we know, I said. Fire, weight, steel, distance. Mason nodded toward the stove. Fire. It reacted to the muzzle flash. It reacted to being shot. Maybe. A metallic sound came from the porch. Both of us stopped. The front door knob moved. Slowly. It turned clockwise until the latch pressed against the strike plate. The oak bar held the door shut. The knob returned to its original position. Mason raised his rifle. The key entered the deadbolt. I heard the teeth scrape inside the cylinder. The lock turned. The deadbolt slid open. The spare key. Whatever stood outside had removed it from beneath the porch, opened Dad's truck, found a wrench, disconnected the battery, and kept the key afterward. The knob turned again. The door pressed inward until the oak bar stopped it. Mason aimed at chest height. Get away from the door. Silence. The pressure eased. A fingernail or claw tapped against the wood. Once, twice, 3 times. Then a man's voice spoke from the porch. Cold. The word was rough and strained. It did not sound like Dad, Mason, me, or anyone familiar. It sounded like a person who had forgotten how to speak. Mason's face changed. There's a man out there. No. You saw the picture. That doesn't make him safe. What if he changes back? What if he doesn't? The voice came again. Please. It was clearer the second time. Mason lowered his rifle slightly. Emmett, he called. I grabbed his arm. Don't. The thing outside struck the door. The entire wall shook. One of the iron brackets holding the crossbar shifted half an inch. A second impact drove the table backward across the floor. Mason fired through the door. The creature screamed. The sound began as an animal's howl and ended as a man choking on breath. Heavy steps crossed the porch. A body hit the snow. We waited. Blood seeped beneath the door. Dark red spread across the threshold. He's hit, Mason said. Stay inside. If that's Voss, he just tried to break through a log door. He also asked for help. He disconnected our truck and dropped a tree across the road. You don't know that. I pointed toward the photographs. We know enough. The blood stopped spreading. Something dragged itself off the porch. Mason listened with his forehead almost touching the door. You think it's dying? No. Why? Because it wants us to think it is. A soft cry came from outside. Human this time. Mason closed his eyes. We remained inside. After 20 minutes, the wind covered every sound. At 3 in the afternoon, smoke began leaking from the stove. I adjusted the damper. The smoke thickened. Mason opened the stove door and flames rolled outward. Chimneys blocked. We shut the damper and smothered the fire with ash. Cold began entering the cabin almost immediately. The creature had climbed onto the roof and obstructed the stovepipe. With the stovepipe blocked, our choices narrowed. If we kept the stove burning, smoke would force us outside. If we extinguished it, the cold eventually would. It knows the cabin, Mason said, or it understands chimneys. It found the spare key. Dad had visitors. Mason looked toward the roof. Maybe Voss was one of them. Dad had hunted with many people over the years. Some I knew, others were names from stories. It was possible Emmett Voss had visited the cabin, learned where the key was hidden, and remembered the layout. If some part of Voss's mind remained inside the animal, then it knew about the root cellar and wood chute. We checked the hatch beneath the porch. The interior door was closed, but no lock secured it. Dad had never needed one. The chute was narrow, barely 20 inches high and 30 inches wide. A person could crawl through with difficulty. Something scratched against the exterior hatch. Mason and I pushed a metal shelving unit across the chute opening. The scratching stopped. A moment later, the creature moved over the roof. Snow slid down both sides. It paced from one end of the cabin to the other, testing the stovepipe, then the chimney flashing. "We can't stay here all night without heat," Mason said. "We have clothes, and one broken window away from 10 degrees. Temperature may rise after the storm. It may drop." He was right. The cabin held warmth well, but not indefinitely. We put on insulated bibs, heavier coats, hats, and gloves. We wrapped blankets around our shoulders and placed chemical hand warmers inside our boots. We also prepared a plan. The meat pole cable ran from the root cellar through a narrow opening in the east wall. The hand winch could pull nearly 1,000 pounds. Dad had used it to raise entire elk carcasses. We removed the cable from the outside pulley by feeding slack through the wall. Inside we formed a loop large enough to cross the cabin floor. If the creature entered through a window or door, we hoped to catch a leg and use the winch to restrain it. It was an improvised trap based on assumptions we could not test. We had no better option. We also collected the road flares from the truck emergency kit. Mason reached the truck through the wood chute while I guarded the hatch. He crawled beneath the porch, moved through the snow, and returned with 4 flares, a bottle of windshield washer fluid, 2 blankets, and Dad's heavy splitting maul. I almost shouted when his face appeared at the chute opening. That thing could have been under there. It wasn't. You don't know that. If it had been, I'd know. He handed me the flares. "You're becoming Dad." That's supposed to be an insult. Depends on the day. For the next hour, the creature remained quiet. We used the time to inspect the roof from inside. The cabin ceiling was exposed timber covered by planks. A small loft window faced south. It had no shutter, but the opening was only 18 inches high. Mason climbed into the loft and reinforced it with a bed frame. I checked the north wall. The 3 wet marks from the previous night had dried, leaving pale streaks on the logs. At 5:20, something struck the west shutter. The impact cracked one of the boards we had placed across it. Mason fired through the wall. The creature moved away before he could shoot again. Seconds later, the loft window shattered. Glass fell onto the bunk. A long dark arm reached through the opening and swept the bed frame aside. Mason fired upward. The arm withdrew. Black blood sprayed across the snow outside and dripped through the broken frame. The creature did not scream. It began pulling boards from the exterior wall. Nails squealed. Mason shoved a mattress against the opening. I climbed into the loft beside him and braced the bed frame with my shoulder. A hand pushed through the broken glass. 5 long fingers closed around the metal frame. The wedding ring was visible beneath matted fur. It was a plain gold band. The fingers tightened. Steel bent. Mason pressed his rifle barrel against the hand and fired. The blast deafened us. The hand vanished. Something heavy rolled off the roof and struck the ground below. Mason stared at the bent frame. "Did you see the ring?" "Yes. Human. Partly. Dad's ring is on the table." I had not been thinking about Dad's ring, but once Mason said it, I looked toward the main room. The gold band from the box was gone. We climbed down. Photographs and papers had fallen from the table during the impacts. The ring was not among them. "You moved it?" Mason asked. "No. We've been inside the whole time." I searched beneath the table, stove, and bunks. Nothing. Mason looked toward the broken loft window. It was wearing Dad's ring. It couldn't be. "You saw it." "I saw a ring. The ring was here. We could have knocked it onto the floor." We checked the floor. If the creature had Dad's ring, it had entered the cabin at some point without our knowledge. Or someone else had taken it earlier. A thought occurred to me. I went to the red wool coat hanging beside the door. Dad's pockets were empty except for a folded paper matchbook and a small brass compass. The lining on the left side had been cut. Inside, sewn between the wool and inner fabric, was a thin leather pouch. Mason watched me open it. The pouch contained a second wedding band. This one was wider and scratched along one edge. "Which is his?" Mason asked. I compared it to the empty place on the table. "I don't know. Dad worked with machinery and sometimes removed his ring. He may have owned a spare. He may have kept one hidden because the first had become loose. There were ordinary explanations. Then I saw an inscription inside the band. ER, 1979. Not Dad's, I said. Our mother's initials were LR. Dad married her in 1972. Mason took the ring. Emmett Rourke. No. Emmett Voss. Initials don't match. A photograph fell from the box as Mason moved it. The image showed Dad standing beside the meat pole in 1998. Another man stood with him, holding the antlers of a 6-point bull. He was tall and thin, with dark hair tied behind his neck. On the back Dad had written 2 names, Frank and Elias Wren. Mason held the photograph beside the ring. ER. Neither of us knew the man. The animal outside might not be Emmett Voss at all. The missing hunter could have been another victim. Elias Wren might have visited the cabin, learned where the key was hidden, and left his ring in Dad's coat. Or Dad might have taken it from him. I turned the photograph toward the lantern. Elias's left hand rested on the elk's antler. His second toe was not visible, but his right hand was. The index finger ended at the first knuckle. The hand that reached through our loft window had been complete. The inconsistency suggested we were dealing with more than one person. Snow blew through the broken loft window. The interior temperature had dropped below freezing. Mason covered the opening with a tarp, 2 blankets, and the remaining bed frame. We could not relight the stove while the chimney remained blocked. Condensation formed on the logs and froze. At 7 we heard movement beneath the floor. The root cellar hatch lifted half an inch. The shelving unit scraped across the dirt below. Mason and I stood on the trap door. Something pushed upward. The hinges groaned. Wood chute, Mason said. The creature had opened the exterior hatch and crawled inside. We had blocked the inner opening, but not securely enough. The trap door rose again, this time hard enough to lift both our feet. Mason fired through it. The bullet tore through the wood. A deep grunt came from below. The pressure stopped. Black liquid seeped through the hole. Move the table, I said. We dragged it over the hatch and stacked the food boxes on top. Mason wrapped the chain around one table leg and secured it to the stove base. The creature scratched beneath us. Its claws moved from one side of the cellar to the other. It had entered a confined space, yet it did not attempt to break through the thin floorboards elsewhere. It concentrated on the trap door. It knew that was the entrance. The scratching stopped after several minutes. A new sound followed. The hand winch turned, 1 click at a time. The cable loop on the cabin floor tightened. It slid across the boards toward the cellar opening. The creature had found the winch handle. Mason grabbed the cable. Let go, I said. If it pulls this through, we lose the trap. It can pull you down. He released it. The steel cable vanished through the wall opening, whipping across the floor. We heard the winch accelerate below. Then it stopped. The creature had dismantled the only restraint we thought might hold it. It knows tools, Mason said. It remembers them. From being human? Maybe. Then it knows everything a man knows. Not everything. How do you know? Because it keeps trying doors instead of setting the cabin on fire. Mason stared at me. That's not comforting. The floor beneath the table struck upward. One leg cracked. We shifted our weight onto it. Another impact split the trapdoor. A claw came through. Mason swung the maul. The iron head struck the hand and drove it back. The creature screamed from the cellar. The sound rose through the cabin floor, part howl, part human voice. The table jumped again. The chain pulled tight. One of the trapdoor hinges tore free. We can't hold this, Mason said. I took a flare from my pocket. We open it. What? When it comes through, light hits it first. You don't know if fire works. We're about to find out. We moved the food boxes and stood on opposite sides of the trapdoor. Mason held his rifle. I gripped the flare. The table shifted. The trapdoor rose beneath it. I kicked the broken leg away. The creature pushed upward. Its head appeared through the gap. The face was neither fully wolf nor human. The muzzle had shortened. Dark fur covered the cheeks and forehead, but the nose was flatter than before. The ears lay close to the skull. Teeth crowded a jaw that seemed too small to contain them. One amber eye looked directly at me. I struck the flare. Red light exploded across the room. The creature recoiled. I thrust the burning end toward its face. It dropped into the cellar, striking the wall hard enough to shake dust from the beams. The flare's heat changed it. Where sparks touched the fur, the skin beneath tightened and pulled. The forearm gripping the hatch narrowed. Fingers shortened, then lengthened again. The creature struggled to maintain one shape. Mason fired into its shoulder. I threw the flare into the cellar. Flames reflected from the dirt floor. The creature retreated through the wood chute. We heard it force its body into the narrow opening, scraping against both sides. Boards cracked beneath the porch as it escaped. Mason slammed the trapdoor closed. So fire works, he said. For now. We had 3 flares remaining. The chute restricted the creature. It could enter on 4 legs, but turning, standing, or using its arms became difficult inside the narrow passage. Its size worked against it. The root cellar was still our only alternate exit. We began rebuilding the trap. The winch remained below, but the cable had been pulled partly outside. Mason opened the trap door while I held a flare ready. The cellar was empty. Smoke from the first flare drifted near the floor. Mason climbed down and retrieved the cable. He also found a dark clump of fur and a section of skin caught on a nail near the chute. The skin was pale beneath the hair. A tattoo crossed it. Only 3 letters were visible. RN. Alas Ren. The man in Dad's photograph had been outside our cabin, or something wearing part of him had. We placed the tissue in a metal food tin so we could show it to investigators if we survived. The creature circled the cabin again at 8:30. This time it stayed beyond the lantern light. We heard it moving through snow, sometimes on 4 legs, sometimes on 2. The rhythm changed without pause. 4 quick impacts became 2 slower steps. 2 steps became the soft crunch of a heavy animal. It shifted shape according to what it needed. In wolf form it moved faster. Upright it could use tools. Between those forms it could reach, climb, and strike with tremendous force. Mason sat against the east wall, pale from pain and cold. His bandage had begun bleeding again. "You should take antibiotics," I said. "They're for infection, not blood loss. They're also all we have." He swallowed 2 tablets from the first aid kit. "I need to tell you something," I said. "Now?" "Yes." "Is it useful?" "No." "Then wait until we're not being hunted by a man-wolf. It's about Dad." Mason closed his eyes. "Of course it is. He asked me to call you the night before he died." Mason opened his eyes. "I know. I told him your phone went to voicemail." "It did." "No." Wind pressed against the cabin wall. I forced myself to continue. "I didn't call." Mason stared at me. "Why?" He was angry. I was angry. He wanted to go home, and I told him he couldn't. He said you would understand. I thought if he talked to you, you'd blame me or try to move him. You let me think I missed it. Yes, for 11 months. Yes. Mason stood. The movement made him wince, but anger carried him across the room. "You listened to me blame myself." "I know." "You watched me stand at his funeral and say I should have answered." "I know." He shoved me against the wall. The impact knocked my rifle from my hand. Outside, the creature stopped moving. Mason held my coat in both fists. "You decided for everybody. Just like you're deciding about this cabin. I was wrong. That doesn't fix it." "No." "You think telling me now makes you honest?" "No." "Then why now?" "Because we might not leave." The words sounded selfish as soon as I said them. Mason released me. "That's for you, not me." He turned away. A knock sounded against the front door. 3 gentle taps. The creature had been listening. It struck the door before either of us could lift our rifles. The oak bar cracked. 1 iron bracket pulled partly free from the logs. A second impact broke the chain bolt in the floor. The table slid backward. Mason grabbed the bar and forced it down into the remaining bracket. The creature hit the door again. A split opened along the center plank. Through it I saw an amber eye. I fired. The door erupted in splinters. The creature fell from the porch. "Root cellar," I said. "We don't know where it is. We know the door won't hold." We moved the table and opened the trap door. Mason lowered himself first. I handed down the rifles, ammunition, flares, food, blankets, and lantern. The front door flexed inward. Another strike would open it. I climbed into the cellar and pulled the trapdoor closed. We dragged the shelving unit over it from below. The cellar smelled of dirt, fuel, and burnt hair. It was warmer than the cabin, but too low to stand upright. The wood chute extended 12 feet beneath the porch. Its outer hatch opened downhill into a depression partly sheltered from the wind. Our plan was to wait until the creature entered the cabin, crawl through the chute, and escape into the timber. We had no vehicle and no safe road, but remaining inside guaranteed another attack. Ruth's ranch was roughly 11 miles northeast. An abandoned line shack stood near Crowell Creek, 5 miles from the cabin. If we reached it, we could find shelter and possibly an old radio repeater used by ranch hands. The creature broke through the front door. We heard wood split above us. Heavy footsteps crossed the cabin. The animal moved slowly, searching. It overturned the table. Papers scattered across the floor. Then it stopped directly above the trap door. Mason held his rifle toward the ceiling. The creature scratched once at the wood. It knew we were below. I pointed toward the chute. We crawled. Mason went first, pushing his rifle ahead of him. I followed with the remaining equipment tied to a short rope behind my boots. Halfway through, the creature struck the trapdoor. The shelving unit tipped. Another impact tore the last hinge loose. I heard it descend into the cellar. "Move," I whispered. Mason crawled faster. The chute narrowed near the exterior hatch. Snow had packed against the opening. Mason pushed with both hands but could not move it. Behind us, claws scraped inside the cellar. "It's blocked," he said. "Kick it." He rolled partly onto his side and drove both boots against the hatch. It shifted an inch. Cold air entered. The creature reached the chute. A hand closed around my ankle. The grip was hot despite the cold. Claws pressed through my boot leather. I kicked backward. The hand tightened. Mason turned and fired past me. The muzzle blast filled the chute. The creature released my leg. Mason kicked the hatch again. Snow collapsed inward. We crawled beneath the porch. I emerged last and turned with a flare. A wolf's head filled the chute opening. Its shoulders jammed against both sides. I struck the flare and pushed it forward. The creature snapped at the flame. The heat forced its head to change. The muzzle pulled inward. Teeth shifted. A human eye appeared where the animal's eye had been. It withdrew. "Run," I said. We moved downhill from the cabin. The storm had begun weakening, but snow still fell heavily. Darkness and wind reduced visibility to 30 yards. We stayed among the trees rather than entering the road. The creature was faster in open ground. Timber limited its ability to charge, though it also concealed its movements. Mason led toward Crowell Creek using Dad's brass compass. My left ankle hurt where the creature had grabbed it. The boot leather was punctured, but the claws had not reached skin. Behind us, the cabin windows glowed. The creature had knocked over a lantern. Fire climbed the interior wall. For a moment I considered turning back. Dad's photographs, coat, tools, and 30 years of our family's life were inside. Mason grabbed my sleeve. "It's gone. We could put it out. The thing is still there. It might burn. Then let it." Flames reached the roof. We continued downhill. The fire illuminated the clearing enough for us to see a dark figure step onto the porch. It stood upright. The body appeared almost human from a distance, though too tall and narrow. One arm hung longer than the other. The creature watched the cabin burn. Then it looked toward the exact place where we had entered the timber. It dropped onto 4 legs. We ran. The terrain below the cabin was steeper than I remembered. Snow covered loose rock and deadfall. We moved diagonally across the slope, using trees for balance. The creature followed without hiding. We heard it crashing through brush 50 yards behind us. Mason stopped beside a fallen spruce and aimed uphill. "Keep moving," I said. "We can't outrun it. We don't have to. Timber slows it. It's gaining." He waited until the animal appeared between 2 trees. The wolf form came low and fast, shoulders rolling beneath dark fur. Mason fired. The animal stumbled but continued. He fired again. The creature turned sideways and vanished behind the fallen spruce. We moved. 10 seconds later, something ran parallel to us on the uphill side. It had changed direction without making a sound. I pulled a flare and struck it. Red light filled the trees. The creature stopped behind a trunk. Only one hand was visible, wrapped around the bark. The wedding band glinted in the flare light. "Elias," I shouted. The hand tightened. A face leaned from behind the tree. For one moment it was human. The man was older than in Dad's photograph. His hair and beard were gray. His cheeks were hollow. Blood covered his shoulder and chest where our bullets had struck. His mouth moved. "Frank?" He knew Dad's name. I lowered the flare slightly. Mason did not lower his rifle. "Who are you?" I asked. The man stepped from behind the tree. He was naked except for blood, fur, and strips of torn skin that seemed to shift along his body. "Cold," he said. Then his jaw lengthened. Mason fired. The man dropped forward and became the wolf before hitting the snow. It fled uphill. "You shot him while he was talking," I said. "He was changing. He knew Dad. He tried to kill us. He might know what happened. He is what happened." We moved toward Crowell Creek. The flare burned for several minutes before I threw it into a snowbank. Darkness closed around us again. The creature did not attack immediately. It had learned that a direct charge exposed it to gunfire and flame, and I expected it to try something different. We reached the creek shortly after 10. The channel was 8 feet wide and partly frozen. Water moved beneath a thin surface layer. Crossing would leave us exposed, but following it downhill added nearly 2 miles to the route. Mason tested the ice with his rifle stock. "It won't hold." We weighed. "Boots fill, we freeze. We need the other side." We moved upstream until we found a fallen tree spanning the channel. The trunk was narrow and coated with ice. Mason crossed first. Halfway over, a howl rose from the forest behind us. Another answered from downstream. Then a third from uphill. "More than one," Mason said. "Or echoes." The first howl came again. The second followed with the same length and pitch. It was repeating itself from different positions. The creature could move quickly, but not that quickly. Unless the sound was intended to make us think we were surrounded. "Go," I said. Mason reached the opposite bank. I stepped onto the log. The creature emerged behind me. It stood upright at the edge of the creek. In the moonlight filtering through clouds, its body changed continuously. Fur receded along the chest, then returned. The face shortened and lengthened. Hands became paws and hands again. It did not appear to be transforming deliberately. The fire and gunshots had destabilized it. Blood fell from several wounds, steaming in the snow. It watched me cross. "Frank," it said. I stopped. Mason shouted my name. The creature took one step onto the log. Its foot was human. The second toe ended halfway down. "Did you know our father?" I asked. The creature's expression shifted. He knew. What? He knew the door. What door? Mason fired over my shoulder. The bullet struck the creature's upper arm. It fell from the log into the creek. Black water closed over it. I crossed. We ran upstream. Behind us the creature thrashed beneath the ice. Its head broke through once in wolf form, then disappeared. We reached the line shack at 11:40. It was smaller than the cabin, built from milled lumber and sheet metal. The door hung crooked, but the roof was intact. Inside were a rusted bunk, an empty propane bottle, broken fence tools, and a wall-mounted radio connected to a battery system. Mason examined the equipment. "Battery's dead. Can you fix it?" "With what?" He removed the cover. The radio was old but simple. A solar panel on the roof should have maintained the battery during summer. Snow and age had likely drained it. Mason connected the radio to a small battery pack from one of our lanterns. The voltage was low, but the display flickered. He turned to channel 7. Static filled the shack. "This is Mason Rourke calling Crowell Ranch. Emergency traffic." No answer. He repeated the call. A voice came through. "Rourke, identify location." Mason grabbed the microphone. "Old line shack north of Burnt Fork. 2 injured. Dangerous animal. Truck disabled." The voice was female but distorted. "Hold position. Ruth, hold position. What's your name?" Static. The radio clicked again. "Do not open the door." Mason and I looked at each other. "Ruth?" he asked. No response. A minute later the radio spoke without the transmit light activating. "Cold." Mason disconnected the battery. The voice continued through the unpowered speaker. "Please." He ripped the radio from the wall and threw it outside. The creature had not followed us physically. It had found another way to reach the shack. Or it had been waiting there. Something moved beneath the floor. The line shack stood on concrete blocks with an open crawl space. Claws scratched against the boards below our feet. We backed toward the door. A hand pushed upward through a rotten plank. Mason swung the maul. The creature withdrew. "We can't stay," he said. "We can't make the ranch tonight. We make the ridge. Get signal on the handheld. The batteries are half dead." "Half is enough." We left the shack through the rear window as the creature broke through the floor. The ridge rose another 1,000 feet north of Crowell Creek. Reaching it required climbing open sage slopes where the wind had stripped much of the snow away. We moved with the final road flare ready. The creature followed at a distance. Sometimes we saw the wolf form crossing below us. At other times a human silhouette appeared on the ridge ahead, forcing us to alter direction. It was steering us east, away from Ruth's ranch, toward a deeper section of the gravelly range. "Stop following the easiest ground," I told Mason. "You want to climb that?" I pointed toward a band of exposed rock and dense timber. "It doesn't want us there." "How do you know?" "Every time we turn north it gets ahead. Every time we turn east it stays behind." Mason studied the slope. "North, then." We climbed through the rocks. The terrain slowed us, but it also slowed the creature. We heard claws scraping stone below. Twice it attempted to approach and retreated when we aimed the flare downhill. At 1:30 in the morning we reached the ridge. Wind had cleared the sky enough for stars to appear. The temperature was falling rapidly. Mason turned on the handheld radio. "This is Mason Rourke on channel 7. Emergency traffic. Any station respond." Static. He tried again. A man answered. "Rourke, this is Beaverhead County Search and Rescue Relay." Mason nearly collapsed with relief. "We're on the ridge north of Crowell Creek. Cabin burned. 1 injured. Animal attack. Confirm number in party. 2. Stay on ridge. Crowell Ranch has a snowcat moving toward your location." "How long?" "Approximately 90 minutes." A howl rose from the slope below. The radio operator heard it. "Was that a wolf?" Mason looked at me. "Yes," he said. "A very large one. Maintain fire if possible. Do not separate." "We know." We found a cluster of boulders that blocked the wind on 3 sides. There was no wood for a proper fire, so we used dry branches gathered from beneath nearby firs and lit them with the final flare. The flames remained small but bright. The creature circled below the ridge. It did not approach the light. For nearly an hour we believed we might survive by waiting. Then the fire began to fail. The wood was damp, wind flattened the flames. We added pieces too quickly and smothered the coals. Mason tried to relight them with matches. The creature moved closer. We heard it breathing beyond the rocks. I held the flare, but it had almost burned out. Red light pulsed weakly along the slope. "Search team's close," Mason said. "Not close enough." The creature stepped into view. It was human again. Elias Wren stood naked in the snow, his body covered in wounds that should have killed him. The wedding ring remained on his left hand. He looked exhausted, with no rage left in his face. "Frank said you would come," he said. Mason raised his rifle. "Don't move." Elias looked at him. "You have his face." "What did our father know?" I asked. The man shivered. He closed the door. "What door?" "Under the ridge. There's no door." Elias smiled faintly. There was. His body bent. Bones shifted beneath the skin with slow mechanical pressure, like weight moving through joints built for another purpose. Mason fired. The rifle clicked empty. He reached for another cartridge. Elias crossed the distance between us before he could load. The creature struck Mason and threw him against the rocks. I drove the burning flare into its chest. Fur ignited. The thing recoiled, clawing at the light. Mason grabbed the splitting maul and swung. The iron head struck the creature's shoulder. It fell to one knee. I took the steel cable we had carried from the cabin and looped it around the creature's neck and arm. Mason understood immediately. He pulled the other end around a boulder. The creature rose. The cable tightened. It dragged both of us several feet through the snow. Mason wrapped the cable twice around the rock and used the maul handle as a lever. The creature changed shape under tension. Its shoulders narrowed into a man's, allowing the loop to slip. I moved behind it and pulled the cable lower, trapping one arm against its torso. It turned toward me. The face was Elias's. "Your father fed it," he said. "What?" "Not me." The wolf face returned. It snapped inches from my throat. Mason struck it again. The creature collapsed against the boulder. Headlights appeared on the western slope. The snowcat. The creature saw them. It stopped fighting. For 1 second Elias Wren looked through the fur and blood. "Don't let them open it," he said. Then he twisted free of the cable. He did not attack us again. He ran east along the ridge and disappeared into the darkness. The snowcat reached us 12 minutes later. Ruth Crowell was driving. A county search and rescue volunteer rode beside her. 2 more men followed on snowmobiles. Ruth found Mason lying against the boulder and me holding an unloaded rifle. She looked at the blood, cable, and scorched fur. "Where did it go?" she asked. "East." Her expression changed. "Toward Burnt Fork?" "No. Deeper into the range." Ruth closed her eyes. "That's worse. They transported us to her ranch, where an ambulance met us after sunrise. Mason had 2 cracked ribs, a dislocated shoulder, and deep bruising along his back. My ankle was sprained. Both of us had mild hypothermia. Wildlife officers inspected the cabin site after the storm cleared. The building had burned to the foundation. They found wolf tracks, human footprints, spent cartridge cases, blood, damaged truck parts, and the section of tissue we had sealed in the metal tin. The official explanation was that a large habituated wolf had followed us to the cabin after feeding on an illegally killed elk. Investigators suggested that an unknown trespasser or injured hunter created the human prints. No one explained how the tracks changed in the middle of open snow, or what appeared in the trail camera photographs. The memory card was taken as evidence. When it was returned 3 weeks later, the images from Tuesday through Saturday were missing. The wildlife laboratory tested the tissue from the cellar. The first result identified gray wolf mitochondrial DNA. The second identified human tissue. The final written report classified the sample as contaminated. Elias Wren had disappeared in February 1999. Ruth told us this after we left the hospital. He had been one of Dad's hunting partners. During their final trip together, Elias claimed they had found a sealed opening beneath a rockslide east of Burnt Fork. Dad called it an abandoned prospect tunnel. Elias believed it was something older. They entered together. Dad came out alone. He told searchers that Elias had fallen through unstable ground. They searched the area for 4 days and found nothing. Afterward, Dad reinforced the cabin shutters, added the oak door bar, built the wood chute, and stopped hunting after dark. He never reported seeing Elias again. "Why didn't he tell us?" Mason asked. Ruth looked toward the mountains. Maybe he thought it would end with him. Emmett Voss was found alive 2 days later in an abandoned sheep camp 20 miles south. He was dehydrated, frostbitten, and confused, but he had not been attacked by a wolf. He remembered hearing an injured man calling from the timber. Each time he approached the voice, it moved farther away. He survived because he stopped following it. Emmett had all 10 toes. I never learned what Elias meant when he said Dad had closed a door beneath the ridge. The location in the old photograph burned with the cabin records. Ruth refused to take us there. Mason and I did not sell the property. There was nothing left to sell except 20 acres of timber, a burned foundation, and a road we no longer wanted to travel. We transferred the land to a conservation trust under the condition that no public trail or structure be built on it. Mason and I speak regularly now. He never forgave me completely for Dad's final night, and I do not expect him to. I gave our surviving photographs, medical notes, and timeline to the people who produced this account. Channel members can examine the recovered images and extended case file. I include them because the fire did not end it. For 9 years neither of us returned to Burnt Fork. Then in November 2017, Mason called me from his home outside Billings. He had installed security cameras after tools began disappearing from his garage. One camera faced the back pasture. At 4:17 that morning it recorded a large gray wolf walking along the fence. The animal stopped beneath the camera and stood upright. For 6 seconds a naked man faced the house. He was older than Elias Wren had been in Dad's photograph. Scar tissue crossed his chest and shoulder. A plain gold wedding band remained on his left hand. Then the man dropped onto 4 legs and continued toward the timber. Mason sent me the video. I watched it once. Before deleting my copy I paused on the final frame. Snow covered the ground behind the animal. Wolf tracks led from the fence to the camera. Beyond that point the trail became human. The left footprint had a shortened second toe. The right footprint did not. It had my father's boot tread.